hundreds of so-called consistency accountability statements each year. These statements will inform Parliament and the wider public that the government's proposed legislative initiatives, whether primary or secondary legislation, are inconsistent with one or more of the principles of the Regulatory Standards Act. Likewise, there will be endless statements from ministers explaining the reasons that the government is given for these inconsistencies. And this process will continue until or unless the Act is repealed or amended. So I have a simple question for this committee. Why would any sane or sensible Parliament wish to enact such legislation? What worthwhile purpose could it possibly serve? Certainly not the public interest. And why would multiple ministers want to make themselves look stupid? Not just once, but repeatedly, every year from here on, potentially until eternity. I would welcome your answers, and I think many citizens would be interested in these answers as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that submission. We have reached time. I appreciate you coming into the Select Committee room this afternoon.
Thank you.
The New Zealand Federation of Multicultural Council isn't quite here yet, but we have Charlene Bryden, who's the next submitter. So if she's ready, we might jump to her. Charlene, I can see you up in the panel. Are you ready to come on?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Welcome. We've got you for 5 minutes.
Okay.
In your hands.
Kia ora. Yeah, I'm an archaeologist who works throughout the South Island. And my concern, of course, is lessening of protections for heritage sites. I do not want those protections lessened, either for cultural or historic heritage. We do not want to enable destruction, and we certainly do not want a lessening of any freshwater protections. We've had many decades of companies and destructive practices, which we do not need to continue, and that includes forestry, mining enterprises. They discharge into rivers and streams. We've seen many cases of that. This supposed bill will not help any of that. And we certainly do not want to see that there be any urgency required for this bill being rushed through. No lessening of the Treaty of Waitangi. I mean, that certainly helps most of us here in this country. There's a reason why we have that treaty, and that is why we're all here. I would suggest if people do not want that, they should maybe move elsewhere. There are other countries who don't have these treaties, and most of us find that quite important in our living and working areas. I certainly oppose the conflict of interest I see with a minister being appointed to a proposed board who would also appoint like-minded individuals, which would, to me, lead to corruption, as we see in other countries, possibly bribery, something we certainly don't want to see here. I also do not want to see any companies or corporations or private landowners gaining more right than the New Zealand public to our environment and our shared heritage. We all care about those. And we certainly should not allow anyone to have the ability to seek or sue funds from our government and the public purse, or from Māori if they do not get their way on consenting. It's an affront to all us ratepayers. I think actually that's probably myself that I've covered. And I do not support Seymour and whatever bill he is trying to push through under urgency. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Charlene. We don't appear to have any questions for you.
Yay.
Thank you for your submission.
Thank you.
We're now going to jump ahead to Tanya Waikato, who's ready, I believe.
Tēnā koutou. Ko putoa ki te maunga, ko rangitai ki te awa ko Ngāti awa te iwi, ko ngā mai hi te hapu tū te ao, tū te pō. My name is Tania Waikato. The Regulatory Standards Bill is an affront to the constitutional foundations of Aotearoa. It is a cowardly, covert attack on Te Tiriti o Waitangi that desecrates the partnership between Māori and the Crown. The bill is a blatant and audacious attempt by the ACT Party and its foreign sponsors to subvert our democratic processes for their own private gain and constitutionally entrench their far-right political views into the very fabric of our society. Regulatory Standards Bill will create a new regulatory constitution that will impact every facet of our laws, our society, and our country as a whole. The influence and control that it will give to the ACT Party and Minister Seymour is dangerous, undemocratic, and unjustified. Te Tiriti is under attack yet again, less than 6 months after the Treaty Principles Bill was banished from this House. It is an abuse of the legislative process to allow these continued and ongoing attacks on Te Tiriti and on our democracy. The Regulatory Standards Bill is an attempted legislative coup and a power grab by a party who garnered a mere 8% of the vote. The bill represents a serious threat to our democratic system through the deliberate concentration of power in a single minister, a non-elected board, and a ministry who will hold an unreasonable level of power over all other ministries. The information gathering powers provided in the bill are unjustified, go well beyond the scope of the policy problem identified, and raise significant red flags about the introduction of fascism to this country. The Regulatory Standards Bill seeks to implement a profound, far-reaching constitutional transformation with respect to Te Tiriti under the guise of improving lawmaking and reducing unnecessary legislation. The supreme irony is that the bill itself was assessed as being unnecessary legislation by the Ministry for Regulation itself. The Minister has provided no explanation for why he is ignoring his own ministry's advice and proceeding with this bill that seeks to make him the most powerful politician in this country. I was counsel for the urgent Waitangi Tribunal claim into the Regulatory Standards Bill on behalf of Toitu Te Tiriti. In summary, the key findings of the Waitangi Tribunal's urgent inquiry were that, firstly, the Regulatory Standards Bill is of constitutional significance. If the bill is enacted without meaningful consultation with Māori, it will constitute a breach of the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, specifically the principles of partnership and active protection. Secondly, there was no targeted consultation with Māori on the Regulatory Standards Bill, a point that was accepted by the Crown. As a result of that failure, the consultation process by the Crown for the bill was fundamentally flawed. Finally, the Crown must immediately halt the advancement of the Regulatory Standards Bill to allow for meaningful engagement with Māori and the dialogue envisioned by the treaty partnership. We do not think the bill should progress in its current form. The final point I have to make is about the escalating security risks surrounding this bill as a result of the Deputy Prime Minister's actions. Last week, myself and 2 of our female expert witnesses had our addresses published by right-wing extremists inciting hatred and violence against us because of our opposition to this bill. I had to have a security escort to come here today to present this submission. Let that sink in. A security escort to give an oral submission on a bill that falsely claims to be about improving legislation. These right-wing extremists have followed the lead of the Minister for Regulation, David Seymour, who has published photos of other academics online who have been critical of this bill, including Dame Anne Salmon and Dr. George Laking. And in doing so, the Minister has given implicit support to the actions of these extremists, to target experts and others who are speaking out against this bill. So the question I have for the members of this committee who are supporting this bill is simple. Is this truly the kind of democracy that you want? One where academics and lawyers are having their personal safety threatened for opposing a bill, where the Deputy Prime Minister uses taxpayer dollars to fund online campaigns that lead to the inciting of hatred and violence? Is that your vision for New Zealand? Because if it is not, you need to take a good, hard look in the mirror and decide what side of history you want to be standing on when it comes time to vote for this bill at the second reading. This is not a game. Our democracy is being eroded further and further by the second, and if you continue to support this bill through to enactment, each and every one of you will be complicit in the introduction of fascism that underlies this bill. So I implore this committee to act in the best interests of all New Zealanders and stop this rot before it is too late. For the sake of our country, our children and our grandchildren, the Regulatory Standards Bill must be wholly and utterly rejected. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. We've gone quite a bit over time, unfortunately, so we don't have any time for questions, but I have to come back to Huhana and Rawari and next speakers if we can allow. We're going to go to the Environment Network Manawatu organisation that are online, I believe, and ready to go.
Kia koutou. Just trying to set my video up so you can see us.
You're right. Welcome. We've got you for 10 minutes, but of course, if you can finish a little bit earlier, it allows time for questions.
Awesome, thanks. Kia ora koutou. Ko Max tōku ingoa. I'm the General Manager here at Environment Network Manawatu, and with me I've got Becca Bell, our Chairperson, and Jean Hera, who's on our board as well. So just a little bit about us. So ENM is all about connecting and inspiring communities for environmental action. Our vision is that the ecological and human communities in the Manawatu River catchment are living in harmony, and we believe that all life is part of a thriving, self-sustaining ecosystem. We've got 64 members in the Manawatu region, in the Manawatu River region, working towards 4 POs, so climate action, community food sovereignty, circular economy, and biodiversity protection and enhancement. We're recognised as Palmerston North City's City Council's sector lead organisation for the environmental sector, and we're part of Environment Hub's Aotearoa, who spoke to one of the committees yesterday. We were able to feed into that submission, and we definitely support that submission as well. Our motivations are our responsibilities to care for each other and for the earth. We're motivated to become better TTT partners. We see that as a founding document of the country, constitutionally part of who we are. We're all about collaboration and inclusivity, and we have a belief that small actions can have a big impact. So the process for our submission is that we went out to our board, had a discussion about submitting to this bill. We believe that it's a really important fundamental bill to oppose, and that it is going to have some pretty bad consequences if it goes ahead. So we sent a draft of our submission to our membership for feedback, and feedback was incorporated into that before being submitted. Our membership was also invited to provide input into what we're saying today, and as I said, we are strongly opposed to this bill and recommend that it is dismissed, basically. So I'm going to hand over to Jean, who had a big part to play in preparing the bill and has had a good read of it herself.
Yes, so we have stated that we oppose the bill in its entirety. This bill, in our first sentence, we say this bill ignores Te Tiriti Waitangi collective rights and undermines protection of the commons with its neoliberal, individualistic, private property and corporate freedoms agenda. So the freedom of the individual, the freedom to, really undermines the protective freedom from, and that is crucial to our submission and what concerns us. So to start with, I have read the bill, and it is complex, confusing and ill-defined, and many legal and constitutional experts have said that it's unworkable. It puts power in the hands of a small group. We're all about sharing power. This is about a power grab, so that you have the Minister of Regulations and a small board of 5 to 7 having that power to interfere with everything, really. So we believe it should be about power with, not power over. So we want to see things that increase participatory democracy. The treaty is our founding covenant, and we believe it's essential to, well, it is essential to the constitutional makeup, so we cannot support a bill that undermines this and excludes it as a founding principle.
A couple of other concerns that we have is, number one, we're concerned about the unintended consequences that this bill might have for individuals, for the community, for the environment, for both in the present and in the future, for our future generations. We are firm believers that it costs less to protect our environment and to protect what we've got than try to restore it once the damage is done. So concern about not enough thought being given to what could go wrong, what are the unintended consequences that could arise from this bill, and also really briefly around the focus on individualism rather than our communal responsibility to each other and to tie our environment. In a world where we're increasingly fragmented and polarised, and I don't think that needs to be elaborated on very much, I think the last thing that, or what ENM believes is the last thing we need is further legislation that further promotes an individualistic approach and the concern for the individual rather than the concern for the common good.
And so on that point, in the words of one of our members, sent some feedback this morning and noted, in his words, this bill tips the balance in favour of individual rights rather than individuals contributing to collective rights and our obligation to each other and our environment. So, we were talking just before about that. Individualism isn't just about all for me or all, for me and my family. It's actually about that responsibility to our communities and our country and each other and our environment. He goes on to say, I'm concerned that this bill may become a lever that will damage the core nature of our strong collective culture of unity. In conclusion, ENM understands that this bill would undo the environmental and social protections put in place to make life better for all peoples of Aotearoa and the lands, waterways, air, flora and fauna that we care for. We urge this subcommittee to throw the bill out in its entirety.
Thank you for your submission. There doesn't appear to be any questions for you, although we have time. Yes, Huhana Linden.
Thank you. And thank you very much for your submission today. I wanted to ask just a general question. Are there any improvements that can be made to this bill whereby you might generally support it? I mean, we've heard, the depth of your worries and concerns, but, is there any improvement that can be made, or should it wholly be stopped in its tracks right now?
We believe it needs to be stopped in its tracks. Yeah, there's nothing, it's broken.
I think something that focuses so much on the individual with absolutely no recognition for the collective good or for Te Treaty o Waitangi. I mean, I wouldn't like to see it try to, it's just too big to be fixed. If that makes any sense.
Thank you. We've got a question also from Rawari Waititi.
Kia ora. Thank you for the presentation. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Now, just read your submission. So just to get some clarity, so could the bill make it harder for future governments to pass strong environmental protections for clean rivers, climate action, biodiversity, if they conflict with private property rights?
Yes, that's our understanding.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean the way that the bill sets up this committee that needs to look at every piece of legislation that comes through and then say, oh, is this going to have too many regulations to make it too difficult? It's all about making things easier for people to do what they want and not what's really important to keep safe. To keep our environment safe, to keep our people safe.
So just to confirm, will this bill make it easier for wealthy property or corporate interests to block or weaken regulations that protect community well-being?
Yes, to block, yeah.
And to cause costs to communities, to ratepayers, to the public from the damage that's done, from any destruction.
And in a world now where we're all concerned about rising costs of living with no end in sight, we're not just talking about the impact, the environmental impact, the social impact, but the financial impact on individuals, families, and communities that have to pay for the damages that are done.
And our local councils too, for that matter. We work closely with our local city council and district council.
Hey,
Yeah,
Mr. Chair, have I got one more? Can I ask one more? Just before you, just very quickly, could the bill's principles be used to challenge regulation on public health, housing standards, fair wages, or consumer protections if they interfere with individual freedoms or business profits?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
That's our understanding, and others have submitted on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Environment Network, for your submission today. Appreciate it.
Cool, thank you. Thanks for your time. Kia ora.
We're now going to live cross to Select Committee Room 4, where we've got the New Zealand Federation of Multicultural Council, presented by Pancha Narayanan. Welcome.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. We have you for 10 minutes, but of course, if you leave some time at the end, we can ask questions.
Thank you. Am I sitting in the right place and can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. Pancha Narayanan, very privileged to be invited to share our views. First and foremost, apologies for being late. Lost my way to get to this place, and it's
Easily done.
Ominous that it's the same way that we felt about the bill as well. 750,000 people that we have a reach to. Very often we do not have any problem communicating. On this occasion, we were not able to share what this bill was about because it was so long-winded and somewhat complex. After reading it a little bit with some appreciation, we felt that to go through this bill to defend it needed a lot of legal knowledge and perhaps academics as well, too complex for communities. On the surface of it, it appeared as if it was trying to bring consistency across legislation and regulation, which would have got a tick. But underneath it, we observed serious omissions, neglect. The thing is that if we are trying to achieve consistency across all legislation, maybe the question that needs to be asked as well is that how do we apply the Treaty of Waitangi consistently across all legislation as well? This one sort of completely ignores it, and that worries us with all the work that people have done, the investment that New Zealand has done in the past, right? We find that this sort of negates, undo everything that we have done in the past to bring harmony in this country. And I think that is there. It protects property owners and at an individual level. We don't understand what that means and how that sits with the Treaty of Waitangi as well. So having had a conversation with all our regional councils, 25 multicultural councils around the country, from Whangarei all the way down to Invercargill, with good relationships with the government of the day and with Tangata Whenua, we feel that this bill is not ready to go forward. It could have been simpler, it could have been more meaningful, and it could have been more inclusive. The way it stands at the moment, we do not see it achieving any of those, right? And I think that it is going to take our country back by at least 25 years of the work that we have done. So my recommendation to the Select Committee is to not move forward with the bill in the way it is at the moment. It may, at one level, bring consistency, but it will be destructive in so many other ways. And in good relationship, the bicultural nature of New Zealand would be questionable if this became law. Just that from me.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Huhana Linden.
Tēnā koe, thank you very much for your submission today. And it was great to hear, the concern coming from our wider parts of the community around the legislation and its potential impacts, particularly on social cohesion, and taking us back a step. In fact, a generation, as you've already pointed out, in relationships between tangata whenua and the Crown and community. From your perspective, are there any ways, because it's all about consistency and the application of consistency across legislation, is this legislation, this bill, actually required? Do you think that there is a gap in this space? And the use of a consistent protection or a te treaty clause, that would be an enhancement, no doubt, I would think, if we were to still follow this line of needing the bill in the first place.
I think the first part of that question, the short answer is yes. Now, it's coming to close to 1 in 4 New Zealanders born overseas, right? Of that, 80% of that population group does not understand the treaty well, because there was no need for us to understand it in any way in living in New Zealand. And that's a shame, really. Right? So when we do not understand that, right, and you have a bill like this intending to become law, right, and the omission of the Treaty of Waitangi, we are nervous about the implications for the future generations, right? And the thing is that what could be done, what changes could be made, keep it simple, keep it consistent, and make sure at the same time that the Treaty of Waitangi is applied consistently across all legislation. And I think that is missing. So I think I'm repeating myself, but that's where we are at the moment. And I think that, to add to your comment, I think there's a serious amount of investment needed in the immigrant community, the multicultural communities, in terms of the awareness of the treaty, right? It is seriously lagging, and I think that it is a blemish on New Zealand to have a treaty and not expect immigrants to know it in some form.
Okay, we're going to go to Rachel Brooking.
Thank you. Just on the point that you've just been discussing, do you think it's also that the teaching New Zealand history in schools will help new generations of immigrants, to your point? And also, if you were going back to Hana's question, if you were going to write such a bill, you've said that you'd want it to be simpler. Are there other things that you'd want included, though, beyond the treaty? Thank you.
2 parts, right? First one, do I think history in schools? I come from Malaysia, and my mother tongue is Tamil. But in Malaysia, if I did not pass Bahasa Malaysia at grade 11, I would fail all the exams. When I came to New Zealand in 1986, I was hearing that Tereo was dying. And I was wondering, how does a national language of a country die? Right? Lack of investments. That's what the impact Kohanga Reo has had over the last 30 years. Right? And I think that is a positive. To be inclusive, if I understand the second part of your question, to be inclusive, right? Before a bill like this is presented, you need to take some sort of an indicative assessment of how well the general public understands something significant like this. I think that the lawmakers at the moment are not interested in canvassing or consulting communities, empowering communities to talk about it, your timeframes, and the kind of language used in your documents are not friendly to people who have English as a second language. Yeah, kia ora.
Kia ora, and thank you for your submission.
Kia ora. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. We're now going to move back online to Eddie Clark, who's making a personal submission.
Thanks for the opportunity to submit. I'm a senior lecturer at Vic Law School, and in fact, coming down from teaching my first class in statutory interpretation just this morning to kick off the new semester. This is sort of my bread and butter, how to legislate, how to interpret legislation, legislative quality. So what I want to do in my submission is, I hope, be helpful to the committee in recommending some changes that I think will improve the bill. So in general, one of the absolute basic principles of legislation, and this is both in the LDAC legislation guidelines and in Clause 8 in the bill's principles itself, is that you only legislate if you need to. You shouldn't interfere in people's lives. You shouldn't create the costs of legislation unless it is necessary. And official advice from the Ministry for Regulation is that legislation is not necessary here. The regulatory impact statement and the cabinet paper both say that officials do not think that legislation is needed, and I agree. What that means is that the bill should not be passed. That would be my first recommendation to the committee. To quote Chapter 1 of the LDAC guidelines, legislation should be fit for purpose. It should be used only when necessary, but when it is used, it should be effective for that purpose, including minimizing unintended costs. So I don't think this should pass, but if the committee is minded to recommend to the House that it pass, there are several changes that in my view could be made to ensure that it is more effective for its purpose and minimizes unintended costs. I mostly cover these in my written submission, so I won't go into detail, but I want to make just a few points. The bill states in Clause 3 that its purposes are to promote accountability for the development of high-quality legislation and regulatory stewardship by the executive and support Parliament's scrutiny of the same. And I note in media comment yesterday in the Herald, the responsible minister said that the intent of the bill was that it brought together in one black letter law many things that the government is already doing. In my opinion, the bill as currently drafted will not achieve its purpose and does something substantially different from what the government is already doing. So if it is to achieve its purpose as stated in its own text and by its architect, some significant amendments are required. I'll briefly mention again, draw in the LDAC guidelines, some reasons I think this is poorly designed. This is in more detail in my written submission. Chapter 2 of the LDAC guidelines asks, do all the provisions of the proposed legislation clearly relate to the policy objective and purpose of the proposed legislation? The answer here is no. Not everything relates to the improvement of legislative quality and scrutiny of legislation. That's not just what all the operative provisions do. Chapter 3 asks whether the bill interacts appropriately with existing legislation and whether there are any issues with clash or overlap. And there clearly are, particularly with the Legislation Act and the Public Service Act. And Chapter 4 sets out generally accepted constitutional principles. A lot of those are present in some version in the bill, but not all of them. And the ones that are have the wording changed to lean sort of to a libertarian understanding of that principle rather than a more generally accepted one. So drafting more consistently with both the wording and inclusion of the principles in the LDAC guidelines would be a significant improvement. I would also note that there is an entire chapter, Chapter 5, on te tiriti and consistency with te tiriti, and leaving that out entirely as the bill does is inconsistent with the existing approach to legislation and thus would not achieve the purpose that the minister has said the bill is trying to achieve. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Eddie. We've got time for one, if there is one. Thank you, Rachel Booking.
Thanks. So, Eddie, I take it that you agree with the LDAC guidelines, and you've also referred to the Legislation Act there, and not all of the Legislation Act is in force, and I think some of it will be repealed. What do you think about that?
So Part 4 of the Legislation Act has never come into force. I think it comes into force automatically in about 6 years afterwards, so I think in about 2 years' time. And that gives some statutory backbone to the disclosure statement requirements. That's what officials at the Ministry for Regulation recommended happen, that be brought into force. And I can see a bill. There is, I think, an opportunity here to write a bill that focuses in a sort of Auditor General Ombudsman way on regulatory quality. The bill as currently written just is not that bill. Pulling together some stuff from the Legislation Act, pulling together some stuff from the Public Service Act, or changing the name of this to the Regulatory Standards Legislation Bill and making some tweaks to those individual statutes rather than a standalone could be helpful. But the vast majority of what's currently drafted in the bill is, in my view, not.
Rawari.
Kia ora, Eddie. Thank you for that presentation. That's actually the first, I think, the first time we've heard a presentation from that particular angle, and so just appreciate the contribution you've made to this particular part of the submissions process. I've got a quick question, and you talked about the impacts that it may have on, the legislation has on the wider public, but also on taxpayer. And will, how much would taxpayer money be spent defending legal challenges, from lobby groups who use the bill to attack legitimate public interest regulations? And have you read in the bill how that may impact on the taxpayer in regards to that particular issue?
In terms of challenges, the bill's pretty clear that you can't directly challenge based on the principles. There may be some Bill of Rights style thumb on the scale with these principles that could lead to some people trying it on, and that would cost a significant amount of money. But I think the bigger financial implication and the big question mark here is that officials clearly identify not a lot in the scheme of things, but still not insubstantial, $20 million in the, funnily enough, enhanced bureaucratic process for something that's supposed to cut bureaucracy. Creating significant bureaucracy is, I think, $20 million a year. And there has been no attempt to quantify benefits.
Yeah.
So in terms of the bill's own cost-benefit standards, it's actually not clear that the bill itself meets those.
Okay, thank you. We have gone a bit over time. Appreciate your submission, Eddie, and good korero with the
Thanks.
panel. We're going to go now to Tangata Whenua Social Workers Association with Merima Scott, I believe, joining us online.
E te whare tēnā koutou. The Tangata Whenua Social Workers Association categorically opposes the bill on the following: the intention, the perspective, and the consequence. The intention and the concentration of decision-making, which has been spoken to previously by other previous speakers, limits perspective and therefore applicability. The perspective and the lack of co-design favours the perspective of those crafting the legislation and the board members overseeing the standards. The consequence is the potential that may ultimately incur financial expenditure, such as the adherence to the legislation and the implementation and sustainability of the standards. We would like to refer you to the Education Ordinance Act of 1847, which set English as the predominant normal language of schools. And while it wasn't made explicit in legislation, schools started to ban te reo Māori, punishing children who were caught speaking it. As a consequence of this legislation, and although it did not, as it was said, include the notion of language, was the loss of identity and therefore no sense of belonging, shame for being tangata whenua, and this was carried through intergenerationally, and the potential of people channeling destructive rather than constructive ways. For those reasons, the Tangata Whenua Social Workers Association opposes this bill. I'm happy to take partai. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, thank you. Huhana Linden.
Tēnā koe te whae, mihi nui ana kia koe. I
Kia
wanted
koe
to ask from a social services perspective and thinking about, you know, your profession and potential impacts or ramifications for the sector in terms of what this regulatory standards bill could do in terms of your professional code of practice, the ripples, I guess, is what I'm pointing to, and knowing also that you have standards which are required as social working professionals, which include cultural competency, which includes an understanding of equity issues and that. So would this legislation potentially undermine all of that infrastructure and work that has been put in by your sector over many years to build something robust that can that you can use as a sector to manage and you know, support the workforce as they grow and deliver services?
Tēnā koe te rangatira. Gosh, that's a wānanga. As you alluded to, we have a registration, social workers registration bill, and as part of that bill, we have competence. But as you may remember, we also have an experience pathway that will be reviewed at the end of next year. And that opportunity is to bring in people who may not have completed a degree in social work, but rather have worked in the social services sector for many years and therefore bring experience into this. Our concern would be that a regulatory standards bill and the board that would oversee that could potentially be a barrier to such people coming into the profession. And I talk specifically around tangata whenua, because for many of our tangata whenua people, their experience becomes absolutely instrumental in how we respond to the needs of whānau, tamariki, hapori, hapu, and iwi. Kia ora.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a supplementary on that?
Yep.
I'm just wanting to explore that a bit further with you and thinking, about the ripples of impact, because I've also heard from sector groups concerns around the ability of that panel to dig into service contracts, to dig into who is being contracted to deliver services, historic as well as future potential services in terms of information gathering. But, you know, like, the equity space is where they were concerned most. Those with disabilities, Rainbow Takatapui, Māori Pasifika migrants, you know, we could all be made, I guess, treated the same. And yet we are different and we have unique challenges. Have you heard those types of worries within the sector?
Oh, constantly. I guess as a profession, as an association, our worry is how do we ensure whānau needs, tamariki needs, hapuri needs are addressed effectively. And once you start to limit that applicability and the breadth and scope of consideration, that becomes a worry in the perspective concentrating in those who make it, the decisions. So that would be our major concern.
Thank you for your submission. Really appreciate it.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. We now have the New Zealand Council for Civil Liberties, and we've got Deputy Chairperson Andrew Ecclestone presenting to us live from Select Committee 4.
Kia ora, Chair. I can just say it's the oddest Select Committee submission I've ever done because there's no MPs present.
Yes, sorry about the timing.
And actually that raises a question I wanted to ask you, because in watching the submissions over the last couple of days, I have not heard any questions from any New Zealand First members. And I wanted to ask if New Zealand First members have been present during committee sessions on a bill that they are committed to passing?
You can just carry on with your submission for now if you like.
Right. If they've not been present, I think that's quite shocking because they're committed to passing a bill and the bill does violence to our constitution and lawmaking, and this absence is doing damage to our democracy. We trust that members of the committee have read our written submission, so I will not spend much time recapping that. In brief, the council opposes the bill and does not believe it should pass. The bill's definition of liberties in Clause 8 is deeply flawed. The bill elevates property rights above other human rights, and this is at the core of its danger to our country. And the Regulatory Standards Board is a nexus for corruption. While I've listened to many of the oral submissions made on the bill yesterday and today, I've not heard them all. But amongst the submissions I did hear, one serious issue that was not mentioned is something the council wants to bring to the committee's attention. Two agencies the council is not often likely to promote the concerns of are the Security Intelligence Service and the Government Communication Security Bureau. We are doing so today because their concerns about this bill echo ours in two ways. First, the way the bill's narrow principles and certifying process will chill policy options that do not align with the principles. And second, the risks created by the Regulatory Standards Board. The intelligence agency's concerns were set out in emails and briefings to their Minister Judith Collins that were disclosed under the OIA and reported in the Post last Wednesday. First, in relation to how the Clause 8 principles create risk. The Clause 8 principles and the requirements for justifying departure from them will chill free and frank advice on policy options where it is easy to show the costs but hard to quantify the benefits. National and New Zealand First MPs are going to want to consider what the intelligence agencies told their minister on 24th of March this year. They advised her, and I quote, "The proposed principles and focus of the bill are not suited to recognise the need for legislation with a national security purpose or incorporating national security elements. Under the proposed construct, it will be challenging to quantify the benefits of national security related elements in order to compare them to more easily quantifiable financial costs. This may make it more challenging to ensure that appropriate consideration is given to national security issues in the development and review of regulation. The agencies consider that a focus on whether regulatory systems are able to achieve their intended purpose would be more appropriate. While the bill proposes a mechanism whereby responsible chief executives would be able to explain where a proposed bill or existing legislation is inconsistent with the principles, this would likely make it more challenging to justify regulation that sought to achieve outcomes such as national security that is not easily quantifiable. Let me make that very clear for members. The GCSB and SIS have said to ministers that this bill is a risk to national security. Do National and New Zealand First MPs want to put New Zealand's national security at risk? Do they want to see policy and legal proposals quashed in the early stages because of the chilling effect of Clause 8 and Clause 9? The intelligence agencies provided a practical example of the risks the bill creates, saying it has significant implications across the public service and has the potential to cause, quote, delays to improvements to other national security legislation as the resourcing of other agencies, for example, DPMC or the Ministry of Justice, may be prioritised to meet the expectations of the bill at the expense of other legislative work programmes. For example, the Ministry of Justice has just begun its review of the Terrorism Suppression Act, which could be deprioritised in response to the proposals. The second area where the GCSB and SIS raise concerns that happen to align with the councils is in relation to the Regulatory Standards Board. In the concluding paragraph of our written submission, the council said that the proposed Regulatory Standards Board is a glaring nexus for corruption and lobbying by vested interests. The committee heard yesterday from Professor Boyd Swinburne of Health Coalition Aotearoa about tobacco multinationals trying to block regulation in Australia. One of the biggest threats to good policy making is the capture or swaying of policy development by people or organisations who work to ensure that they or their clients' interests are prioritised in policy and legislative design over and above the interests of the environment or the welfare of people. Large companies with significant resources are more likely to be successful in these efforts to influence lawmaking than the country's small and medium enterprises, let alone small NGOs or community groups. As we've seen from Radio New Zealand reporting about the cosy relations between the alcohol industry and a manager in the Ministry of Health, these lobbying efforts are often successful in corrupting policymaking that should be reducing harm and improving health. In creating the Regulatory Standards Board, the bill sets up another massive target for big corporates to lobby for regulation that benefits them or for removing regulation they do not like. It's also an incentive for corruption in the form of donations to political parties in return for a place on the board, or for a particular piece of regulation to be recommended by the board to be scrapped or not approved. In their March 2025 briefing to Minister Collins, the SIS and GCSB said this about the Regulatory Standards Board. Given the proposed role of the Regulatory Standards Board, we consider there would be value in national security screening of members to ensure that they are not susceptible to foreign interference. This is particularly relevant as foreign states are likely to have a strong interest in how New Zealand's regulatory environment seeks to manage national security threats. In other words, the intelligence agencies have identified the board as being a target for capture by foreign interests. The agencies are saying that the board too is a risk to New Zealand's national security. Will National and New Zealand First MPs be relaxed when foreign companies, which would not be classed as a foreign power under the Crimes Countering Foreign Interference Bill currently in front of the House, interfere with our regulatory processes? In short, the NZSIS and GCSB have said this bill is a risk to New Zealand's national security. The Council agrees with their analysis. This bill is a risk to New Zealand's security as a nation. As such, voting for this bill in its current form, particularly with the Regulatory Standards Board, is frankly unpatriotic. National and New Zealand First members may bridle at being called unpatriotic, but they will have to wear that label if this bill goes through as it stands. Two of the agencies that governments and the public rely upon to keep them safe has said it is a risk to national security. Countless other agents, including the Ministry of Regulation itself and the Treasury, have said the bill will do harm to the country's policy and lawmaking. What is unpatriotic if not passing legislation that will do harm to the country? In conclusion, this bill does violence to our constitution and norms of lawmaking. If passed in its present form, it will do violence to policymaking and regulating. It will enable harm to people and to the environment and to society. It is dangerous to our country and to our democracy. It is an unpatriotic bill that is a risk to national security, according to our intelligence agencies. If National and New Zealand First MPs do not have the courage to walk away from their coalition agreement on this bill, they should weaken this bill substantially. And while we oppose the bill in full, we have some recommendations for amendments. First of all, you should remove the Regulatory Standards Board entirely by deleting clauses 28 to 40 in Schedule 2. You should insert into Clause 5, the interpretation clause, a definition of person that states for the purposes of this Act, a person means only a natural person and not a legal person. This will mean the principles of liberties in Clause 8b only apply to human beings and not companies. The Clause 8 principles should be revised heavily with a balanced framework that refers to meeting international human rights obligations while developing regulation in an open manner that requires public participation in its early stages, so that it produces regulation that is effective, proportionate, transparent, accountable, adaptable, and treaty consistent. Finally, we think that if you really want to strengthen the way that agencies conduct regulatory stewardship, the way to do it is by amending Section 12(1) of the Public Service Act 2020, so that the duty on public service chief executives to steward the legislation administered by the department requires a published programme of open and participatory review of that legislation and publication of the estimated cost of undertaking these reviews. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate that. We'll go to Cameron Luxton.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Andrew, for your submission. I was particularly interested in the part about the appointment to the board. Do you think that the same risk applies for foreign actors having influence over board appointments to the way the RBNZ board is appointed? And following on from that, the Monetary Policy Committee?
Yes, I think that New Zealand's public appointment system is rife for foreign interference because so much of it is in the hands of Cabinet's Appointment and Honours Committee and not handled by an independent body that would appoint people on merit. It's entirely likely that people are appointed to public offices in this country on the basis of lobbying and donations.
So you're, just to be clear, you're saying the risk for appointments that you've made in the submission goes beyond just this bill and this regulatory board?
Yes, I think we have in New Zealand extremely weak standards for ensuring the integrity of appointments to these kinds of positions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Sorry, we've run short of time. We're going to go to Gollins Commercial Limited, who I believe are also in the select committee room. Christopher Gollins.
Thank you.
Welcome. We've got you for 10 minutes also, so but feel free to leave a bit more time for some questions.
Certainly. As opposed to the New Zealand's Society of Civil Liberties, this is very much a submission based on the effects of poor legislation at the coalface and in respect of a reasonably large section of the New Zealand business community. I represent one of the smallest commercial real estate agencies in New Zealand. We suffer from utterly pointless regulation resulting from personal pique or political grandstanding that robs us of a percentage of our productive time every single day. A key principle of this bill is good lawmaking. The Real Estate Agents Act 2008 is probably one of the best examples of pointless lawmaking this country has ever seen. Former Labour MP for Waimakariri, the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove, openly admitted that his motivation for this legislation was an unfortunate experience with a single real estate salesperson. He promoted legislation to punish. The result today is a regulatory body that today searches high and low to justify itself at a cost of more than $750,000 per annum for each and every one of the more than 17,000 licensed salespeople. The REA's overreach is extraordinary. Today, a salesperson could potentially have their career terminated for failure to obtain a signed agency agreement for the leasing of a small industrial shed. The Act has become a convenient tool for aggrieved parties to extract some consolation for their own errors or misfortune. By far the majority of complaints to the REA are from parties that missed purchasing a property because they failed to offer a high enough price. These hundreds of complaints annually cause good, honest salespeople weeks or months of stress and significant legal costs. The REA Act allows no leeway for common sense. Another example of pointless lawmaking is the overreach of the anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism legislation. Under New Zealand's Torrens system of title registration, a real estate agent cannot transfer ownership of a property. This can only be done by a lawyer or licensed conveyancer. These parties must complete AML vetting for all clients. So must the real estate agent, the accountant, the mortgage broker, the bank or other lending institution involved in the same transaction. Multiple duplication of the same process. The real estate agency doesn't ever handle the funds required for settlement, even if it receives a deposit from the purchaser, and increasingly these are paid to lawyers. There are strict rules around how that deposit must be processed. In our business, we have looked in detail at the stated justifications for current AML CFT legislation at the time of its introduction. In respect of the justifications for including our industry within the business types selected, they were complete fabrications, formulated by parties who had clearly never actually worked in this industry. We respectfully recommend that the Regulatory Standards Bill be passed in its current form. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We've got a question from Cameron Luxton.
Well, thank you, Chair. We've just had a submission previous to this committee stating that there's already oversight of secondary legislation, aka regulations. There's sufficient oversight. I wonder, has the Real Estate Authority or perhaps even the Real Estate Agents Act 2008 ever been reviewed by, to your knowledge, the Regulatory Review Committee, Subcommittee of Parliament, or any other body that's gone through it and found some of these issues that you've brought up?
I don't believe the Real Estate Agents Act has ever been reviewed. I know that currently there is some review of the anti-money laundering legislation, but I understand that review has gone as far as allowing easier access for or easier, making it easier for children's bank accounts to be opened, so that the production of a birth certificate will be sufficient to be able to open a child's bank account, and there will be limits on the amount of funds that can be held in a child's bank account. That makes sense. But in terms of going any further and reviewing the anti-money laundering legislation, I think that's a very slow process. And I might say that we regularly discuss the AML legislation with lawyers, bankers, mortgage brokers, accountants, what have you. Everybody has exactly the same view, that there is duplication, multiple duplication of the vetting process. One thing that would certainly help would be a central registry of verification, so that if a party has been vetted for AML by a bank or by an accountant or what have you, a central registry would indicate that that person has been passed for AML vetting. That would be certainly a giant step in the right direction.
So, sorry, Chair, if I may, Christopher. So, what I'm hearing you say is that the real estate's authority, the regulation set by the real estate's authority, to your knowledge, has never been up to the Regs Review Committee to be looked at. No,
Cameron, that's my understanding.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Christopher. It brings us to the end of questions. Appreciate your submission today.
Thank you.
Also in the room, we've now got Marangamai Working Group on the People's Action Plan Against Racism. Tina Nata is presenting. This will be followed by her 5-minute personal submission. Okay, so we've got you for 15 minutes. Do you want us to separate them, or are you just happy to?
No, I'm happy for it to roll on as a single.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. No worries, welcome. In your hands, and obviously if you allow some time at the end for questions.
Tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou mai, tēnei mokupuna hikurangi maunga awa pu awa Ngāti Porou iwi. Tēnei te mihi anō hoki ki te mano tēnei whenua wēnei wai ki whānganui a tara, a te Aotearoa nei te mihi atu ki a koutou. Ka huri aku whakaaro ki a rātou kua para tēnei huarahi mo te tika, mo te pono, mo te mana motu hake o te iwi Māori, arā ko Moana, arā ko Sid, arā ko Ngāneko, kia Whina, kia Eva, kia rātou mā te rōpua te kotahitanga i ngā tau 50, a Twini, a Hori Kēti, a ngā Hoia, a te hoko whitu atu, arā ke nei te mihi atu ki a rātou katoa. Thank you very much for the invite to speak today. My name is Tina Ngata, and I am just the latest in a long line of people who have dragged this nation to a space of tika and pono in relation to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. I'm also speaking on behalf of Marangamai, the Working Group for the People's Action Plan Against Racism in Aotearoa. We are a collection of anti-racist scholars, advocates and activists who support the National Iwi Chairs Forum and its progress towards an anti-racist future for Aotearoa, and we strenuously oppose the Regulatory Standards Bill. Our definition of racism aligns with international expertise in anti-racism and human rights and is as follows. Racism is a collection of ideas, actions, and institutional practices backed by institutional and social power that produce, maintain, and normalise inequity and inequality for tangata whenua and other minoritised racial groups. This bill meets that definition as a bill that will produce, maintain, and normalise inequity and inequality for tangata whenua and other racialised groups here in Aotearoa. I will speak first to the matter of treaty justice. In 1856, Dr. Isaac Featherston, a member of Parliament, wrote, "The Māoris are dying out. Our plain duty as good, compassionate colonists is to smooth down their dying pillow, then history will have nothing to reproach us with. A few decades later, Dr. Alfred K. Newman, also a member of this parliament, wrote, "Taking all things into consideration, the disappearance of the race is scarcely a subject for regret. They are dying out in a quick, easy way and are being supplanted by a superior race." One would like to think that the time is well past where politicians believed that their role is to make a genocide as comfortable as possible for the sake of optics, or even worse, find it a good thing to kill off an entire race because of its assumed inferiority. We must, however, take heed of the fact that human rights documents like Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or indeed the UN Human Rights Charter or the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, protect our rights of existence. When you place human rights protections at risk, you place lives at risk. By framing treaty protections for Māori and the Bill of Rights protections for minoritised racial groups as potential preferential treatment, this bill constitutes persecution on political, racial, national, ethnic and cultural grounds. That is the actual wording for a crime against humanity under Article 7 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Such harm would be further intensified for New Zealanders who sit within crosshairs of oppression alongside racism, such as misogyny, ableism, religious bigotry, colorism, transphobia, and anti-queer bigotry. What we have seen and are very concerned about is the consistent warping of human rights language by elected officials of this government in an attempt to pass a bill that would actually harm human rights for tangata whenua and minoritised groups in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'll speak now to our international commitments. We have pointed out in our written submission that this bill violates New Zealand's commitments under the Universal Human Rights Charter, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That is 7 of our 8 human rights conventions that New Zealand is party to and which are binding, that they are then riding roughshod over in an abhorrent farce of pretending to protect human rights of New Zealanders. This charade of attempting to paint oneself as a human rights champion whilst riding roughshod over those rights needs to stop now. Human rights authorities, and in fact, the Human Rights Charter and Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, are very clear in situations of injustice like colonialism. Not only can you treat people differently, you must treat them differently in order to fix that injustice. It is very obvious that the actual definitions of these terms, like the treaty principles, are simply inconvenient to this government. But what is also very clear is that the optics of being treaty compliant and the optics of being human rights compliant are also very important to the architects of this bill. It is clear that the authors and supporters of this bill are more interested in the optics of being a human rights champion than actually protecting human rights. It is extremely obvious to us that the authors and supporters of this bill are more interested in the optics of addressing racism than actually addressing it. And in fact, they would rather advance a bill that protects racialized privilege even at the cost of life, all while looking as if they are protecting our human rights. And in fact, that makes us realize that we are not that far away from Isaac Featherston in 1856, as we would like to believe. Finally, I'd like to address the importance of a healthy democracy in addressing racism. This bill is not a reflection of a healthy democracy. The fact that it has even gotten thus far has exposed major flaws in our parliamentary settings. The bill concentrates power in a way that undermines the checks and balances of power under a healthy democracy. It is constitutionally significant, and as such, it should have been carried out under procedural principles that ensure legitimacy, stability, consistency, and popular consent. None of that has been adhered to in the case of the Regulatory Standards Bill. It further lacks evidentiary basis and expert support. Troublingly, the conduct of elected officials through this process has led to direct harm towards legal professionals, as you've heard earlier today, towards distinguished experts, academics, and minoritized racial groups who have been targeted for participating in your democracy. You have elected officials directing hate and subsequent harm towards members of the public for disagreeing with them. The hate directed towards our scholars and academics by the architects of this bill has magnified exponentially on 9, as they knew it would when they put their harmful posts up. That is an unacceptable state of affairs and amounts to a targeted intimidation to dissuade the public from participating in democratic processes. It is a further clear demonstration of a senior elected official who is willing to weaponize the privilege of his platform to direct harm towards members of the public. That is not somebody who should wield the type of concentrated political power that he is trying to give himself through this process and through this bill. At one point, we may have sat here in Aotearoa and looked at other nations whose democracy led to death threats and direct harm and felt lucky that that is not our reality here in Aotearoa. Well, that reality is not only on our doorstep, it is in our house. All because this government has failed to curtail racism within its own ranks. This bill will not only maintain that racism, it will severely worsen it and poses a significant threat to our social fabric. We affirm that this bill is racist in content and process, and we recommend its full rejection. Thank you. I'll now speak to my individual submission.
Okay, I'll just let you know, you have gone slightly over.
Fine.
So you might want to just allow a bit of time for questions in this one.
I'm also a mokopuna of Te Araroa, a small rural settlement on the East Cape, termed by emergency services to be the most remote township in Te Ika Maui, the North Island. I'll speak a little bit more on that context very soon, but I just wanted to point out that in spite of our colonial underpinnings, Aotearoa New Zealand, as you have already heard, received strong praise as being one of the least corrupt nations on the planet. Our government has received this praise from the international community in part because of a well-respected regulatory regime and international rankings for regulatory quality by globaleconomy.com, by the World Justice Project, by the World Bank, and by Trading Economics Group, and by many others. We have consistently ranked in the top 10 of 142 nations for the quality of our regulatory system. Now, that is not to say that it does not need improvement. All regulatory regimes should be open for improvement, but this bill does not do that. Rather, it degrades our regulatory regime. I'd like to draw the Select Committee's attention to the prior iterations of this bill, because it's not just this population rejecting it. Many prior populations and parliaments have rejected it as well. This is the most rejected, reviled, opposed bill in the history of our government. We can start tracking the opposition to this bill from as early as the 1990s and its iteration of the Fiscal Responsibility Bill, born of the era of euthanasia. And that's where I want to speak about my home, Te Araroa. The neoliberal reforms of the 90s and the mother of all budgets were sold to the New Zealand public as economic liberation in much the same way and using the same rhetoric as the current regulatory standards bill. But for rural New Zealand, and certainly for Te Araroa, it economically gutted us. It turned us from a thriving, bustling settlement and township into an economically gutted one. It tethered us to offshore corporations that we are still today economically chained to. So it's unsurprising then that out of this bog of neoliberal greed, we saw the formation of a party that was named to place New Zealand first. If we bring the opposition to this bill forward to the 2000s, we see more clear concerns that were expressed regarding the bill. Sometimes with the best will in the world, bills such as this that try to improve transparency, improve good lawmaking, and try to make things easier, as it were, in fact, to do quite the opposite. I suspect that might be correct in the case of this bill, said Doug Willerton of New Zealand First in 2006. Government departments were also scathing in their opposition in 2011, collectively stating that they believed the costs and risks outweighed any potential benefits, that it would create legal uncertainty and confusion, which brings us forward to today, where the same concerns are being raised again over the same bill. The government clearly has an issue with respecting the denial of consent, and at some point we need to name this as procedural harassment. This bill is an act of bad faith in every conceivable way, from the titling through to the obtuse and leading discussion document to the engagement carried out at the worst time of the year, and yet still New Zealanders took themselves away from their whānau during the holiday period and sacrificed their own time to voice their opposition to that discussion document, only to be called bots by New Zealand's Deputy Prime Minister for their troubles. A Deputy Prime Minister who then also attempted to evade accountability in the Waitangi Tribunal by bringing forward the introduction of the bill. A Deputy Prime Minister who has also arranged for this bill of constitutional significance to have as little time as possible in the written submission phase, followed by as little time as possible in the oral hearings phase, and then as little time as possible to write up the report. A Deputy Prime Minister who has undertaken inexcusable public attacks towards distinguished and recognised experts, and who could have foreseen that we would find ourselves in such a deplorable political situation? Well, our ancestors foresaw that, and that's why we have a treaty.
Thank you,
The bill's
Tina.
proponents, I'm finishing up, I'm wrapping up right now. The bill's proponents have tried to evade accountability at every turn. And if we are being honest, the bill itself is about constitutionalising corporate evasion of accountability, which brings us back to the issue of corruption and what is recognised by political scientists as the most dominant form of corruption in the world, corporate political activity, the collusion of governments and corporations to remove all restrictions to corporations for their interests of extraction and exploitation. That is what regulations are there to protect us from. That is what you are supposed to be protecting us from when you're doing your job right. And that is why you must recommend this bill to be rejected in its entirety. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. We are well over time, unfortunately, so we will have to go to the next submitter, but appreciate you attending in Wellington there. We're now going to go to Eugenie Sage online, who is no stranger to this process. Welcome, Eugenie.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. I oppose the bill and ask the committee to recommend that it not proceed. The bill is fundamentally ideological because it seeks to strengthen and entrench extreme interpretations of private property rights while weakening the government's ability to safeguard collective and public interest. The bill comes from the former Business Roundtable and Act, not from the public service. Previous parliaments have rejected it, and 88% of 23,000 submissions on the discussion document oppose the notion of this bill, yet it has proceeded. One of my biggest concerns is that such a partisan bill promoting ACT's libertarian ideology weakens our parliamentary democracy by promoting public distrust about how ministers and governments use their power and in whose interests they exercise it. That is corrosive of the rule of law and the guardrails that it provides. People have felt the need to convene their own People's Select Committee on the lawn outside Parliament. That suggests a lack of trust in what should be a robust parliamentary process and a view that the statement in the Coalition Agreement to pass the Regulatory Standards Act will trump any recommendations from this committee. That is disappointing. I see government's role as being to protect and enhance the well-being of people and nature so that humans and the other species we share these islands with can thrive now and in future. The bill and its Clause 8 principles prioritise individual liberties and private benefits, issues of cost and property ownership over Te Treaty of Waitangi and over all other objectives, collective goals and public goods. Characterising the Clause 8 principles as the only principles of responsible regulation reframes all other public policy goals such as fairness, public health and environmental protection as being irresponsible. The bill gives excessive power to the Minister of Regulation through their oversight function for all legislation and regulation. It potentially restricts the ability of other ministers to develop and implement legislation in their portfolio areas if it falls foul of Clause 8. The requirements for consistency accountability statements for all government bills and regulations, with some exceptions, with explanations by ministers for any inconsistencies and for extensive cost-benefit analysis will create an avalanche of reports. That will divert public servants from constructive work when funding and staff numbers are being cut across the public service. It's been described as paralysis by analysis. And that's what ACT and its corporate backers are seeking, to shrink the role of government. And some examples now of how the principles will have a chilling effect on legislation to advance collective goals. Providing for public goods such as community safety and essential public services such as biosecurity protection can often involve limits on individual freedoms for the benefit of all of us. Yet the references to liberty and freedom of choice in Clause 8b are broad and not defined. That creates uncertainty and it requires a high degree of subjective judgment by the authors of the Consistency Accountability Statements and the Regulatory Standards Board. The principle risks challenges to measures which promote collective goods such as constraining building development in areas at risk of flooding or inundation from rising sea levels. That limits the role of government to respond to climate change. Person isn't defined in the Clause 5, so potentially includes companies and not just natural persons. Then in Clause 8c, the taking of property, the principle here that legislation should not take, impair or authorise the taking or impairing of property without the consent of the owner unless fair compensation is provided is an attempt to introduce into our law a regulatory takings or expropriation principle drawn from the neoliberal ideology of the United States. Key elements such as what property is are not defined, nor is what constitutes impairment or fair compensation. In the environmental sector, property could include carbon credits, fisheries quota, grazing permits, tourism concession, and exploration and mining permits on public conservation land. Impairment could cover any measure that reduces current or future profits of individuals or companies. Businesses could claim that their loss of future profits from any restrictions on current activities should be compensated. The polluter pays principle is effectively reversed so that non-polluters pay the polluters. The prospect of having to pay compensation could prevent, for example, MPI from progressing sustainability measures, such as reducing the total allowable catch of particular fish species, or the Department of Conservation limiting the number of helicopter landings or commercial concessions on conservation land.
Eugenia, we're just at 5 minutes now, so have you got perhaps some concluding comments?
One final thing, in my submission in paragraphs 57 and 58, put out a number of suggestions about how regulatory quality could be improved without this noxious bill, and I ask the committee to ditch this bill and explore those options with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your submission. Appreciate it. It's probably unusual for you to be on the receiving end after many years in the House, but thank you for that.
Thank you.
We're now going to go to Jane Kelsey, who's actually joining us, I think, live in Select Committee 4.
Yes, I actually came down here to speak face-to-face to the committee, so it is rather disappointing. Kia ora te committee. I have made an extensive submission. It is the 4th time I have made a submission on this bill. I invite, in the rather derisory 5 minutes allocated to me, the committee to reflect on your constitutional responsibilities as you are asked to provide a veneer of legitimacy to ACT's bankrupt bill. A bill already rejected 3 times by the Parliament, and that ACT seeks to bypass similar scrutiny through a backdoor coalition deal this time. David Seymour has made it very clear that he will only listen to those who agree with him, continuing his disdain for democratic processes and for evidence-based policy advice, including from his own officials. My challenge today is to National and New Zealand First for pandering to ACT's ideological fetish yet again in allowing this bill to get this far, and in having committed, unlike the Treaty Principles Bill, to see it into legislation based on the proposals from ACT in the past. And I really invite you to think of what that means for what you say you as parties believe in. We have heard in the Waitangi Tribunal and from submitters already before the Select Committee that this is yet another denigration of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and I echo that, but I want to focus on 2 other matters that have not been so well canvassed. Earlier, we heard concerns that the bill will vest unaccountable executive power in the Minister of Regulation. And I want to talk to that at the same time as the problems with the Minister being able to handpick the Regulatory Standards Board comprised of private individuals. Let me be very clear that from my own experience, David Seymour does not give a toss about transparency, accountability, and good governance. In my submission, I set out a 6-month attempt to get documents under the Official Information Act. Only when the Ombudsman intervened did we get repeatedly, oops, I'm sorry, I forgot about that one. And then again, oops, I'm sorry, I forgot about that one too. My sincere apologies. And then yet again, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't actually realize that the Act applied to verbal decisions as information. And therefore, I've made some handwritten, totally illegible comments on the documents that I've sent to you. Now, I don't actually care whether David Seymour is woefully ignorant of the Act or showed contemptuous disregard for the Act. What he has shown is that he is not someone who can or should be trusted with any executive power, let alone what is proposed in this bill. As Bill Rosenberg has said in his submission, this is compounded by the fact that the proposed board would be an instrument of the minister. The minister can appoint who he wants, sack any members that step out of line immediately without giving any reason. And you can bet, and again, this is based on research, that he will continue the pattern of appointing fellow travellers of ACT, as he did, or as ACT did, with the Regulatory Responsibility Task Force, supposedly having an independent chair, but had Graham Scott as the chair. And when I did an OIA on who was consulted in the drafting of this bill, lo and behold, he consulted Bryce Wilkinson, Graham Scott, with some legal advice from Jack Hodder. These are the people who we will see the minister appointing to the board. And are we going to really accept these unelected ideological partisans are those who should be passing judgment on proposed and existing legislation with the potential to paralyse the regulatory process through a deluge of reviews?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are coming close to full time. If you've got
I
some
do
concluding
not
comments.
want to have questions. I want to finish my submission.
We're at 5 minutes
Go on,
now,
Chair,
so if you
go.
could please make some concluding comments.
This is just, as you will have seen from the letter that was the open letter, such a farce. In my submission, I talk about the issues about regulatory takings, about the consequences that there will be not only in terms of the chilling effect of the potential compensation that will be sought, for example, if National seeks to pursue its introduction of competition in the area of supermarkets and banks and electricity companies, but where you will end up having to make a decision about whether you're going to confess your non-compliance with the principles of this bill, pay massive compensation, or abandon your policies. I pointed out in detail the consequences of a potential investor-state dispute settlement, something that both successive recent governments have said that they do not support because of its legal and fiscal risks. And so I say to the committee, and in particular National and New Zealand First, you have the ability and responsibility to stop this bill now. We have seen the consequences of light-handed regulation in the past. That was a light version of this. Give us Pike River, give us the finance company collapses, give us the leaky buildings, of which I'm currently paying $180,000 to get my one apartment fixed. You have the ability and responsibility to stop this now, and history will judge you very harshly if you fail to do so. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Jane. Committee, we're just going to break for 5 minutes before coming back to hear from Ganesh, and then we'll continue through till 5 o'clock. Thank you. Thanks, Danella. We'll just get Ganesh. Oh, yeah, you're ready to go, Ganesh. I'm just making sure we've got quorum, and we'll get underway. Yep, looks like we have. Awesome. All right. In your hands, Ganesh. We've got you for 5 minutes, but as you would have seen, if you can leave a minute or two for questions, that's helpful.
I'll try. E ngā iwi, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e rā rangatira mā. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Ganesh Ahirao toko ingoa. I'm a first-generation New Zealander born in Aotearoa. For the record, I am neither deranged nor a bot. I am proudly tangata treaty. I stand alongside tangata whenua and strongly urge members of this committee to heed the findings and recommendations of the Waitangi Tribunal contained in their interim urgent report on this bill. I have a PhD in economics from Victoria University Te Herenga Waka, and so I now turn to the economics underpinning this bill. Property rights and power are at the very heart of economics and of this bill. Rightly, there is robust argument and debate over points of contention and substance. I do not resile from that. But using privileged power positions to insult, denigrate, and belittle people and their communities is not robust debate. This committee and the House must consider its responsibilities in the protection of the rights of all to contribute and participate in a safe and constructive democratic process. And that lies at the very core of this bill. Responsibilities and property and rights and economic power. Just whose rights and whose property and whose economic power are to be protected by this bill and whose by omission are to be ignored, and where do responsibilities lie? For I refer to Clause 8 of this bill and the so-called principles of responsible regulation. I note the parallel with the principles of responsible fiscal management now embedded in the Public Finance Act. I ask, what makes such principles responsible? Principles have been applied, but the responsibility of the ensuing fiscal management remains moot. In a similar vein, Clause 8 of this bill contains principles, but whether they are responsible or not remains moot. Notably, there are no criteria provided against which the responsibility or not of such principles can be assessed. Bluntly, to suggest a set of principles are responsible purely because they have been stated as such requires logic involving some spectacularly breathtaking circularity. So the responsibility or not of the principles which underpin this bill falls at the very first hurdle. Thereafter, I infer from the stated principles that responsibility revolves around the rights of property owners, irrespective of any obligations associated with the possession of such property. Additionally, there is no consideration of how such rights and property were acquired in the first place. Hence, I infer that existing property rights of individuals take primacy. Rights relating to collectively owned and operated property are starkly omitted and seemingly irrelevant. And consideration and rights and property of future generations are similarly absent, as are obligations to such future generations. Critically, I am forced to construct these inferences as there is no statement of assumptions. Alternatively, there is no statement of the economic model and the inherent assumptions required to ensure that these principles would indeed be responsible. And as any good economic student should know, the transparency of assumptions is central in the framing of the model through which the economic argument is made. But the assumptions are not transparent in this bill. Further, the economic model consistent with the inferred assumptions may have been relevant to a 17th century view of the world. However, the economic model is wholly and totally inappropriate for a 21st century Aotearoa where collectively owned and operated property and kaitiaki and guardianship obligations to future generations are central to many communities. If this were submitted as a stage 1 economics paper, it would struggle to get a D grade. The economic case for this bill is at best flimsy. It fails the test of transparency. Its assumptions are not transparent. It fails the test of relevancy. Its economic model is not relevant. And it fails the test of responsibility, for there are no criteria with which to assess its assertions of responsibility. Therefore, alongside the clear findings and recommendations of the Waitangi Tribunal, I submit there is a solemn, compelling, and indeed overwhelming case that this bill be discarded in its entirety.
Thank you, Ganesh. Right on time. We're now going to go to Ngā Kamahi Whenua or Ngāti Iwa Charitable Trust, ERA, sorry, with Ngārangi presenting online.
Kei te mute koe.
O ia, kei te rongo koutou, tēnā tātou, ko mātiti te maunga, ko waiwaka te awa, ko whakatohia te iwi, ko Ngāti Ira te hapū, ko ngā kaimahi whenua o Ngāti Ira Charitable Trust, te rōpū, tēnā tātou katoa. This oral submission draws on the lived experience, aspirations, and existing strategic planning of Ngāti Ira as tangata whenua and holders of mana whakahaere over our rohe, as well as our leadership in kaupapa taiha. We're not new to this. Individualism, entrenched power, erased Māori authority. This bill, paraded as raising lawmaking quality, paves the way for unchecked ministerial control, sidelining Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and undermining Ngāti Ira-led environmental restoration, resource management, and economic revitalisation, and the enduring presence of our reo and tikanga, with our whānau ki runga i tō tātou whenua ki roto i a tātou nei wai. We do not support this bill in any way, shape or form. We oppose both the intent and the mechanisms proposed in the Regulatory Standards Bill. Ngāti Ira has outlined in our strategic and policy documents, including our draft hapu management plan and our cultural values, that Te Tiriti o Waitangi is not a symbolic document. It is a living, binding covenant. This is also reinforced in our Whakatohia Settlement Act. This bill deliberately excludes Te Tiriti o Waitangi. This is not an oversight, it is a choice that places private property rights above tangata whenua rights, a choice that gives private enterprise more legal protection than the whenua, wai and whānau themselves. This bill puts a wrecking ball through decades of progress made through treaty settlements, co-governance models, and localised kaitiakitanga arrangements. It strips away the legal recognition we have fought for and won. This is not good law. It's ideological. The bill has not gone through proper constitutional processes, and it is not the first time this type of bill has come through the House. It has not been shaped by the people, and yet here we are. The bill places disproportionate power in the hands of one minister and embeds a narrow neoliberal standard of good law. It claims to be neutral, but is deeply biased in favour of private property owners and economic deregulation, and we've been here before. This bill certainly isn't for the communities navigating climate challenges, biodiversity loss, housing crises, and health inequities. It isn't for the people or by the people. Ngāti Ira has clearly stated in our cultural and planning documents that our environmental responsibilities are non-negotiable. We are bound by whakapapa ki te whenua me ngā wai, by our history to protect our wai and whenua and our whānau, because that's what our ecosystems are. Ara ke te pūtaketanga o te kaitiakitanga ki a Ngāti Ira. This bill, however, does not see the value in nature. only as a commodity. Corporations would be able to claim compensation if the government passes laws that give them rights far greater than ours. And we don't see that as being good regulation. It disincentivizes environmental restoration, penalises community, especially Māori-led efforts. When the whenua and wai lose, the whānau lose. And when the whānau lose, we all lose. Corporations who plunder for profit should not be winning here. This bill weakens both national and local democratic processes if passed. It will make it harder for future governments to enact laws that reflect the will of the people. We do not agree with legislation that amplifies the views of so few and sidelines our rangatiratanga. We do not accept a future in which our treaty rights are optional, revocable, or replaced with private profit mechanisms, unless we're at the table getting those private property and private profit mechanisms ourselves. This bill is a reattempt at a constitutional power grab with no public mandate and no legitimacy. Our alternatives are already in practice. Ngāti Ira has never sat back and waited for the government to do the right thing. We have created our own frameworks, our own plans, our own solutions. Our trust is a living example of that. Our hapu environmental and policy practices are place-based, values-led and outcome-focused. Our mahi strengthens whānau capacity and it centres our reo and tikanga. We are doing the work on the whenua, in the wai, with the whānau and leading with integrity. Increased capacity and capability means increased participation and protection. We have models in motion that balance environmental, social, cultural, and economic aspirations. These are our determined ambitions and aspirations. We are not interested in being regulated out of our own futures by a bill that is tone deaf, tiriti blind, and politically opportunistic. This bill must be withdrawn, not amended, not softened, withdrawn. Kārea Ngāti Ira e tae te whakaaro ki tēnei. We cannot accept a future built on fear, exclusion, and legal trickery. We will not trade our ancestral rights, responsibilities, and obligations for corporate comfort. And we will not be lectured on good law by those who ignore te tiriti and undermine Māori interests. We urge the committee to see this bill for what it is, a dangerous and undemocratic tool to rewrite the rules of this country without all of its people. Ngāti Ira, ngā kaimahi whenua o Ngāti Ira Charitable Trust stands absolutely opposed to the Regulatory Services Bill. Nō reira, tēnā tātou, kia ora tātou katoa.
Kia ora, thank you, Ngārangi. There doesn't appear to be, yes, Rawiri?
Kia ora, tēnā koe Ngārangi mo tērā mo wera kōrero. Look, just picking up on your presentation, there seems to be a huge concern with the bill's focus on individual property rights and the rule of law that conflict with the collective rights and tino rangatiratanga of Ngāti Ira and te whakatohea whānau, te iwi Māori whānau. Are you also concerned that the bill could be used by powerful corporate and public interests to challenge or weaken Māori environmental, social and cultural protections?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've worked far too hard collectively as whakatohea and within ourselves as Ngāti Ira with Crown agencies and external organisations to gain the gains that we've gotten as a hapu who have mana whakahaere over especially the Waihoeka Gorge. We absolutely see this bill as being detrimental to those rights, as you said, e te tungani.
Okay. Kia ora.
Thank you. We're now going to go to the New Zealand Airports Association submission. Back to Select Committee 4. Welcome Stephen Ryden and Billy Moore to the table.
Thank you. I'll look straight ahead, although I can't actually see you when I do that.
Bit of a hybrid appearance, but
Yeah,
good to hear you. You've got 10 minutes, obviously, but feel free to leave some time for questions at the
Thank
end.
you so much, members. Thank you for the time you've given us today and all the other submitters going through this process. My name is Billy Moore. I'm the CEO of the Airports Association. I'm joined by Steve Ryden, our Policy Director. I'll go through this very, very quickly and very happy to answer questions or follow up with any notes that would be helpful to your work. We support the bill's intent to raise the quality and clarity and transparency of regulation. It is responding to what we see as a real problem across the public service, which is a lack of structured and performance-based stewardship or regulatory stewardship across the state sector. It's worth saying up front that airports love regulation, good regulation. We rely on it completely if you think of how important safety regulation is for the entire foundation of our sector. But we benefit from regulation when it is comprehensible and enforceable, not vague or aspirational, where it's consistently applied, not shifting with different people or politics over time, and if it's grounded in principle, not reliant on the goodwill of the regulator. At the same time, we live with the cost of vague regulation and unclear policy intent quite regularly. That cost is real to people who are regulated and entities who are regulated like us. Right now, we are in consultation on an airport regulation process with no clear problem definition, for instance, and that does waste a lot of time and resources, both on the industry side and across government as well. So further discipline and how a good regulatory process should work and the types of tests it should meet should help reduce some of that, that waste that we might see in the system. We do think the bill should improve the discipline of both ministers and officials to avoid cases like this and to be really clear up front about what they're trying to achieve and what problem they're trying to solve. But really importantly, the way we read the bill is that it doesn't make consistency with its principles mandatory. Ministers and officials must instead own the trade-offs that they're making and show they're working. And you will be confronted with a number of different views across different stakeholder groups about how people see that, but being really clear and transparent about the trade-offs that bills and policy involve, we think is something that will improve the system. We've raised in our submission to you one concern we have with the principles, and as I said, different submitters will raise different concerns. The issue we raise is in relation to clause 8C on compensation for property impairment, which we do think will clash with government policies being developed now on protecting infrastructure through spatial strategies and national direction tools. We recommend that this should be clarified since the government has an active policy process underway at the same time in this bill. So there's the opportunity to align those two processes, but we can also talk about other options there. So welcome any questions or clarifications we can add for your work today.
Thank you, Billy. There doesn't appear to be any. I appreciate your verbal and written submissions.
Sure. Thank you very much, members.
Thank you, members.
We're going to move now to Post-Primary Teachers Association, and they're also in the Select Committee. Welcome, Chris Abercrombie.
Sure. So with me is Fran Renton, Deputy General Secretary of the PBTA.
Thank you. Welcome.
Education is a public good. It creates communities and offers opportunities to all New Zealand students. The Regulatory Services Bill is a direct threat to the public good and therefore public education. My name is Chris Abercrombie. I'm a History and Social Studies teacher from Invercargill, and I'm currently the President of the Post-Primary Teachers Association, Te Wahingarua, and I represent secondary and specialist technical teachers throughout New Zealand, and we urge you to abandon the bill. Education is the means by which our rangatahi achieve their dreams and their aspirations. It is the profession from which all other professions are fostered. New Zealanders value it highly, and they value many other aspects of the public good, such as healthcare. The Regulatory Standards Bill seeks to place the interests of corporations and private property owners over those elements of the public good that help us all to thrive. The Regulatory Standards Bill therefore fundamentally opposes the values and objectives of PBTA Te Wahingarua. It is also a blatant attack on the rights of Māori and the obligations of the Crown to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, The PBDA constitution pledges to advance and affirm Te Ture Waitangi, and therefore we oppose legislation such as this bill, which fails to protect treaty rights and collective ownership of resources. Any restrictions on the government's ability to raise revenue for education is a huge concern. It means larger class sizes, worse facilities, fewer opportunities, and overall decline in engagement and achievement for students. The coalition government has made much for the need to improve attendance for students, and as yet proposes this bill would actively work against that goal. It is not enough to say there is no intent in the Regulatory Standards Bill to reduce revenue for public services such as education. By prioritising the rights of corporate interests and property owners, there is a necessary threat to the public good. To give a specific example, let's imagine in a future government wishes to fund an education initiative to provide ongoing professional development that is run by teachers for teachers. They could be challenged under the Regulatory Standards Bill because this initiative could impact profits for private professional development companies. Paying compensation to these companies would prove such a barrier to this initiative that it would no longer be feasible, leaving teachers without a valuable professional development opportunity, which of course in turn works against our educational aspirations for our students. Finally, PBDA oppose the attack on democracy this bill represents. It is bad enough that future educational resources could be subject to challenge from private interests, but this is challenge to be decided by an unelected regulatory standards board is completely unacceptable. Furthermore, that this board would only have to consider the principles of RSB and not the broader impact of the issues gives unprecedented privilege to corporate interests over public services, worker safety and the environment. PBDA Te Whangarua strongly opposes this bill and urges you to recommend it be abandoned. Toi tū te matarangi, toi tū na kula, we stand for public education. Kia kaha, solidarity forever.
Thank you, Chris. We've got a question from Rawari Waititi.
Tēnā koe, Chris, and thank you for that presentation. Just a quick couple of questions. Could this bill be used by private school operators to challenge fair enrolment rules or public curriculum standards?
Well, that's one of the concerns we have is that it is so far-reaching it could have those impacts. School zones, all of these things that might have an impact on profits could be challenged by private individuals or groups. So it's a real concern for us.
And does the bill strengthen or weaken the Crown's ability to deliver free, high-quality public education for every child, no matter where they live?
And we believe this would be a threat to be able to deliver that, as it could remove revenue from that helps support public education. And it's a real concern because we know that access to high-quality public education is what's going to help solve the problems of the future that we're facing as a nation.
So there's huge concern around new education policies like better resourcing for children with learning needs be undermined if private interest claims they breach property rights or cost more than they benefit.
Absolutely, that could be one of the concerns, as I mentioned, that what could happen with professional development initiatives. We know there's a lot of private providers, and if things change in that space, they could challenge that provision of the public good.
Tēnā koe, Chris. Ngā mihi.
Thank you. I saw Huhana's hand, but it's gone.
I had a question, Mr. Chair, but it was addressed around our disability support and, the risk to those in the sector and private interests.
All good. Okay, good. Thank you, Nigel, and for your submission. Appreciate you coming in.
Kia ora, thank you.
Kia ora. We're now going to go to the Greater Regional... Sorry, I'll start again. This must be just about time. Greater Wellington Regional Council. We've got Nigel Corey there. Kia ora and welcome to you both. You've got 10 minutes, of course, but feel free to finish early for questions.
Kia ora, Adrian Staples, tōku ingoa. I am the Deputy Chair of the Greater Wellington Regional Council. Thank you for your time today. And with me, I have Nigel Corey, who is our Chief Executive, and Council Officer Carl Chenery for technical questions. Greater Wellington Regional Council has many and varied roles, as I'm sure you're aware: environment, public transport, bulk water, parks, leading responses for emergencies and infrastructure, etc. In the 9 years I've been at the council table, the one thing that has really struck me about this council is it is very solutions focused. And so that is one of the reasons why I find it unusual that we have got to the position we have over this bill. Now, you have our submission, which we will take as read. It's a comprehensive submission, but I'd just like to raise a couple of points about this. We oppose the bill in its entirety and request that it is abandoned. And as I said, coming from a solutions-based council, that is unusual. If we could identify how to redeem this bill and fix it, we would, but sadly, we can't. We're also supporting our mana whenua partners' concerns in opposition to this bill, including Ngā Hapo o Waitaki, Atiawa ki Whakaronga o Tai, Ngāti Toa Rangatira, and Rangatira o Wairarapa, and they've all submitted in opposition. If you do proceed with this bill, we support the submission of Taituara that the local government secondary legislation must be out of scope. Now, the key points that I would just like to identify is that we're not sure what the problem is that you're trying to fix, and you can't have good legislation if you don't know what the problem is that you are trying to fix. Our second real major concern is the undermining of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Now, regardless of whether you get into the populist politics of whether we should have road signs in Te Reo or say a karakia at the beginning of a meeting, Te Tiriti o Waitangi is our founding document of modern New Zealand, and I find it, I find that its abandonment is abhorrent. And rather than working in partnership with our Indigenous people, we seem to be trying to work around them. This bill will impact on councils, creating legal risks, economic inefficiency, complexity, and increased costs for ratepayers, our partners, and communities. And I find this really, really frustrating at a time when government is trying to emasculate councils' ability to do their work by rates capping, that you are putting or attempting to put in legislation without identifying the costs to councils and what that will mean. We believe it will lead to a worse outcome for our taio, our partners and communities, and for our regional economy as a whole. So I'd like to pass over to Nigel to discuss the last 2 points and to give you some examples of how we believe that this bill will affect local government. Thanks, Nigel.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou, ko Nigel Corrie, Tokongawa, he tungu whakarai aho. I'm the Chief Executive of the Regional Council. As Adrian said, there's 3 things we'd like to highlight by way of example of where we are very concerned about some of the deficiency in this bill that will have a major impact on the services provided by local government, in this case regional councils. Firstly, as many submitters have talked about, the reversal of the polluter pays principle is a key concern and will remove fundamentally any incentives for polluters to reduce the impact on environment. Our understanding of the bill is that through the public, through taxes or rates, would be required to compensate polluters if they were required through legislation to reduce activities that harm the environment or would impair their property rights. This is a huge potential burden on the taxpayer or the ratepayer, who would then become financially liable for those costs at the expense of the collective good. And the exposure to the ratepayer and the opportunity cost of having to invest in an area that's poorly defined in the bill could be significant. Secondly, I'd like to focus on the impact it could have on other benefits for the long-term future to taio, particularly in areas such as conservation, biodiversity and pest control. There's a very short-term focus on private benefit, which could absolutely affect the ability to invest in these long-term incentives, such as predator control, replanting programs, or the protection of habitat of taonga species. All of these cases, the long-term benefit of investment in these areas, often in partnership with communities who want to co-invest as well, can far outweigh any immediate cost or cost-benefit analysis that would be proposed under the bill. Māori approaches to conservation, including their rights to exercise kaitiakitanga, could also be challenged by the bill's focus on individual rights at the expense of the collective rights. And thirdly, in the case of regional councils and our public transport authority roles, driving legislation towards private benefit and away from public good can stop expanding public transport initiatives for the public good, such as supporting community-led initiatives, connecting marae to Papakainga services in less profitable areas where access to transport is deficient or non-existent and where there's a higher need, such as disability access upgrades and initiatives to reduce public transport emissions. All of those initiatives and the core public service provided by public transport could be undermined by unequal treatment and or inconsistent and centralised efficiency metrics or cost-benefit assessments as outlined in the bill.
Thank you, Nigel. A few closing remarks. I want to close by emphasising the harm this bill will do to our ability to uphold tita reti and our partnerships. It is the wrong solution to improving regulation. Local government plays a critical role in giving effect to tita reti o Waitangi, and we take seriously our position as a visible representative of the Crown in our communities. We are deeply committed to our enduring partnerships with mana whenua built over more than 30 years. These relationships are key to our success protecting the environment and delivering infrastructure that meets the needs of our region. By constraining our ability to meet our commitments to our partners and protect our taio for all our communities and generations to come, the bill would make our impact and therefore our partnerships ineffectual. We would collectively fail in our duty to deliver for our communities and our environment. Happy to take any questions. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Adrian. We have a question from Rawiri Waititi.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou. Look, just how will this bill affect council's ability to pass local bylaws on issues like rental housing, building standards, healthy homes, or even urban planning?
Tēnā koe Rawiri. One of the things that's not clear in the bill is the definitions of secondary legislation and what the scope of what this applies to. So both in terms of whether all local government plans, including bylaws, are included within the scope, and also the definition of property, as Nigel has spoken to. So additional information requests on local government justification back to the set of principles that are outlined in the bill, which are inconsistent, as Nigel and Councillor Staples have said, for the collective good. So those are some of the key ways.
And could it make it harder for local communities and councils to put in place rules that protect their environment, safety and social standards?
Oh, without doubt. In the absence of a clear definition of actually what is a secondary bill, that imposes a risk right there. And even if there were a greater definition around that, the nature of the way the bill is currently constructed would simply assume that there would be an overriding of those community and local based aspirations.
Kia ora, thank you very much.
Kia ora. Thank you. Sorry, we have met time, Huhana. I'll come back to you on the next one if that's all right. Thank you all three for your submission.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate you coming in. We're now going to move to Tex Edwards, who's in Select Committee Room 4 from Monopoly Watch.
Sure.
Tex, you know the drill.
Thank you. I'm Tex Edwards. Heartfelt condolences to Pāti Māori. I'm very sorry you lost your colleague, and heartfelt condolences. I'll talk like a horse racing commentator, but don't hesitate to ask questions. And I have some numbers, and Rawiri, I think, is left, but I had answered to one of his questions he answered earlier about a number. At Monopoly Watch, we don't do politics. At Monopoly Watch, we study network industries. We study monopolies and how they impact the public interest. We study supermarkets, electricity industry, banking, building materials, and we've studied telecommunications. We have some experience in breaking up a cartel. We research on how to fix broken markets that aren't working in the public interest. Supermarkets aren't working in the public interest, not just on pricing, but also on nutrition and sustainability. Banks are a disgrace. Kiwis are just being milked by Aussies. We want to anchor some points, and then we want to take some questions. And we want to talk about monopolies in utility industries and also in healthcare and the impact of this bill on healthcare matters. We believe in property rights, like most Kiwis, and we believe in property rights for property. We don't believe in property rights for monopoly rents. Here is a diagram. I don't know if I've done a very good job here. Can you see this? Can you see this, committee? This diagram shows the valuation of something. This part of the diagram shows the property of the business, the properties it's got, the software it owns, the racking systems, the warehouses, the vehicle it owns. And then this part of the value is what we call in investment speak, the alpha profit or the invisible alpha, the excess return on equity, the monopoly rent, okay? Of course, we want to go out and we've got a cost of capital of 8%, 6%, 7%, but we don't need to charge the consumers a return on equity of 30%. And I'll circle back, if I may, and talk about the Airports Association, because that wasn't the Airports Association we had sitting here 2 or 3 minutes ago. That was Auckland Airports, the business that's a $35 billion business that was bought off the government for $900 million. That sends $2 billion a year to its punters. So I'll circulate this amongst the committee because it's an important investment concept, and the fundamental flaw of the property rights that the bill attaches to monopoly rents needs further investigation, because to a previous speaker's observation, investment markets have sort of changed and institutional investors have ESG responsibilities, and it's actually an own goal, because if this bill passes in its current format, New Zealand will get so horrifically downgraded in the investment community. It's quite a substantive problem in keeping our capital markets going. Economic efficiency means you have to remove the economic dead loss weight from the economy. How to explain why the New Zealand economy is performing so badly is because you have this milking machine called monopoly rents. You have the supermarkets taking excess profits out, taking it Aussie. You have the banking industry, it's just off the charts. It's like $4 billion a year. That's $4 billion. That's like 3% of GDP. That's a proper number. You've got the electricity industry doing pretty much the same. The building materials industry doing a couple of billion a year. And I was grateful for your question earlier, Rowie, in terms of what the numbers are. And for ease of conversation, this bill anchors compensation claims in the major network utility businesses. Let's, for friends, just call it 20 to 60 billion in supermarkets. And if you look at my submission, I apologise profusely, I had the decimal point in the wrong place. That's 20 billion, not 2. Banks is about 80 billion, because banks are taking out 4 billion a year of excess profitability, sending it to Aussie. Sadly, we're not Aussies, we're Kiwis. And so this $4 billion of excess profitability, the capital value or the compensation value of that is 80 billion. So if this bill passed, we would have claims anchored against not just any challenger, but also the government. And that's a serious substantive issue. We've had this movie before. We've been in this movie before, and it was called the Bormog-Willig precedent in the 90s, when we had this company called Telecom. Erroneously, it was sold to some private investors. They anchored the fact that it was a monopoly, and then government passed legislation that anchored the obligation to pay a monopoly rent for the use of any of their infrastructure. Fine. You have to rent infrastructure from Telecom. Fine. You have to pay them. Fine. You have to pay them the international benchmark rate. But actually New Zealand anchored the fact that you had to actually pay a component. So going back to my little diagram here, and I will circulate this in more detail, but you actually had to pay the excess profitability rate to Telecom. That's why it was a $25 billion company. And that's why when the government intervened, it's now a sort of $7 billion company, respectively. Chorus and Spark, you add those puppies together, it's $7 billion. It used to be a $25 billion company. And so it gives the committee, a sense of some of the huge numbers and some of the real compensation numbers available. Now, because we have to think laterally about this conversation, and we have to understand it and look through. Has anybody else done this type of legislation before? Has there ever been a regulatory standards bill that entrenches monopoly rents like this? And the answer to that is yes. And the New Zealand cricket team are playing in that country in 3 weeks' time. And it's called Rhodesia. I'm serious. And in 1965, the British said to the Rhodesians, hey, can we do a bit of democracy, work in the social good? And there was a small group of people, about 6 or 7% of the population, said, no, let's have unilateral declaration of independence. And some of the clauses in the bill are actually the same as UDI.
Hey, Tex.
Sorry
to interrupt you, but there are a couple of people with questions, but you are going to run out of time if you
okay,
don't.
mate. Okay, no worries. Working with the questions, but that UDI thing is really serious because it actually led to a really nasty war that went on, and it did entrench the monopolies. And if you're a Māori presentator here, you'll go, hey, well, the Rudd concession was the Treaty of Waitangi photocopied. They didn't have a photocopier in 1860, as you know, but they copied it out hand and then they sent it down to Rhodesia, and it was the same document. So I'll take some questions, but the real issue here is New Zealand's been written up in textbooks about these difficult monopolistic control decisions. Our lack of competition in these capital-intensive industries is catching us. We're working on a 20-country downgrade with Transparency International. So currently we're number 3 in New Zealand, less corrupt. Forget corruption from the sort of 70s and 80s and brown paper bags and Mercedes-Benz and corruption, but talk about influence swamping. And influence swamping is occurring. And the impact here is actually not going to achieve what the proponents of this bill were trying to achieve, which is actually virtuous, trying to make New Zealand a better place for investors. Investors have changed their personality. Investors are the Cincinnati Firemen's Pension Fund. They have a different ESG mandate. Open for questions. Thank you, Orion.
Cameron Luxon, we might have time for one question. Or
yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, okay. My question is, Tex, thanks for this. You're obviously keeping a good eye on monopolies. How is creating regulations that lead to geographic monopolies or regulations around the building industry about extremely high standards that are difficult to comply with and isolated to these aisles alone, therefore meaning other countries, companies in other countries around the world don't see New Zealand as a viable market? How do those lead to creating monopolies? And would having some questions around the viability of those regulations, the actual cost benefit of those, lead to maybe in your view, a limiting or monopolistic power created by regulation?
I appreciate the point. It's a really good one. And it was canvassed in the 2022 Commerce Commission market study into building materials, where it was identified that the big building material monopolies wanted regulation because they used that to protect their incumbency. The real issue was scale in the building industry, and that there was no scale of assemblers, and that actually the industry had cut itself up, and they were handing out not geographic monopolies, but actually product monopolies. So quite a complex story, but to answer your question, the monopoly value in building materials was in assembly. And so people were handing out monopolies. There was a portfolio of monopolies in different products. And there was no vertical integration and assembly of houses. And that's how New Zealanders got to pay 5 times too much for housing.
Thanks, Tex. We have met time. Appreciate your submission.
Thank you.
And look forward to your diagram.
Cheers.
We're now going to hear from the National Centre for Women's Health Research, Aotearoa. We've got Dr. Anna Adcock and Professor Bev Lawton. Welcome, ladies.
Tēnā koutou e te committee. Thank you for this opportunity to present this oral submission in opposition to the Regulatory Standards Bill. Ko Anna Adcock, tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no Ngāti Mutinga. I'm a health researcher and social scientist.
Ko Bev Lawton ahau, ko te atanga ahoiti te iwi. I'm Professor Bev Lawton. Tēnā koutou katoa, thank you. We're speaking on behalf of Te Tātai Hora Ahine, the National Centre for Women's Health Research, Aotearoa, based at Te Herenga Waka, the Victoria University of Wellington. We're a rupu of Māori and non-Māori researchers, clinicians and kaumātua. Our mission is to eliminate preventable harm and death, and to support the well-being and flourishing of all people in Aotearoa. For this reason, we strongly oppose the Regulatory Standard Bill. We acknowledge and tautoko the whakaaro to date on this deeply flawed bill. Today, we highlight the bill's potential to worsen health inequities, especially for whānau Māori, and the critical gaps in the design of this bill.
Our centre has a track record in driving system change through research, evidence, advocacy, and translation into policy. We are deeply concerned by the bill's emphasis on formal equality and its erasure of te tiriti or waitangi. The claim that every person is equal before the law is patently untrue. It sounds fair, but in practice, it elevates sameness over fairness and ignores the deep structural inequities Māori continue to face. This flawed framing risks obstructing legislation aimed at redressing those inequities, including kaupapa Māori approaches and affirmative action. In short, this bill privileges whiteness and risks our future as a nation by not recognising the value and contribution of Māori and our diverse population. It is a huge step backwards. Today, we will speak to 3 points: why health equity requires tailored policy, why public health and the well-being of the people must not be pitted against profit, and why the erasure of te tiriti or waitangi is not only unjust, it is dangerous. Firstly, health equity is not achieved by treating everyone the same. Māori health outcomes are shaped by colonisation, structural racism, and chronic underinvestment. Addressing these requires kaupapa Māori solutions, targeted funding, and equity-driven policy, not blanket universalism. The bill's focus on equal treatment is based on a foundation of ignorance. It threatens to undermine necessary Māori-led responses, even though they are essential to achieving flourishing. We haven't yet achieved fairness, let alone flourishing. We need to take steps forwards, not backwards.
And for example, as an example, let's take perinatal care. The care we give in pregnancy and when birthing and when the baby's born. For the last 15 years, there's been no change and the perinatal death rate, the death of our mothers, the death of our babies. This has not changed, and it particularly impacts on Māori, Pacific, and Indian whānau, and those in high deprivation. These disparities are not random. They're the result of systemic failure, and they will not be solved through universalism. We require everyone working together, the voice of the community, to lead the way. Treating everyone the same is not fairness, it's erasing. It's erasing. And these are real babies and real mums, and they're being harmed. And we need to address this, and this bill will not do this. It will harm.
Our second concern is around the risk of deterring public health protections and solutions. The bill proposes that compensation may be owed when regulation causes private economic loss. This could deter governments from introducing vital public health protection, particularly those that prioritise the country's well-being over private profit and respond to Māori-led calls for change. This frames regulation through a commercial lens, not a well-being one. That's a dangerous precedent.
I would just like to enter into a positive example. And we've been thinking very carefully about this. With our research on HPV self-testing, and I brought a prop, but most women in this room will know what this is, to prevent cervical cancer. And this is a program that was launched in 2023, and it was based on kaupapa Māori research, the voice from the community, working together in real time with government, Te Whatu Ora, and voices from other groups working with every part to produce a program. And this program has launched with great success, and it's also increased coverage for Māori, for Pacific, and for everyone in Aotearoa. So therefore we have a program that addresses inequities that came with a tuapapa, a foundation for Māori. This would not happen under these regulatory principles. And we're very concerned about that. This is not just hypothetical. I'll give you an example exactly, which has been really successful, and we need more of them. Thank you.
Thank
Last
you.
but
Oh,
not-
sorry. Apologies.
Last but not least, this bill does not mention Te Tiriti or Waitangi. It omits any reference to partnership, active protection, equitable outcomes, or tino rangatiratanga. This is a profound omission. Te Tiriti or Waitangi is not optional, it is foundational. It should be celebrated and upheld. Cultural safety, whānau-centred care, and local responsiveness are vital to Māori health. Whānau and community voices must be central to system design. These rights are affirmed under Te Tiriti or Waitangi. Yet, under this bill's narrow and individualistic framework, they may be viewed as inconsistent or deprioritised entirely. We're particularly concerned that cultural safety training, already fragile in the health system, could be weakened under this bill's framework, and that calls to strengthen and extend it may be dismissed as unjustified. Likewise, kaupapa Māori research that centres Māori realities and informs life-saving policy, may be seen as incompatible with the bill's regulatory principles. This undermines progress not just for Māori, but for all New Zealanders.
As a research centre with proven international alliances, including across Indigenous networks in Australia, Canada and the US, and allies globally, we are gravely concerned that the bill puts culturally grounded, equity-enhancing research at risk. The bill does not protect Māori rights to shape systems that support our well-being. It does not support Māori to flourish. I've given you an example of what happens when government works with community and with evidence, and how we can get better systems that save lives. And that's what we want. We want supporting to work our systems to improve the health of our people. This bill represents, if it's passed, opportunities lost for flourishing, and I may say cost effectiveness. Because if you have a healthier people and a flourishing people, then it's definitely going to save money.
In conclusion, we oppose this bill because it undermines equity, it creates barriers to Māori health progress, disincentivizes tailored policy, and removes Te Tiriti o Waitangi from the regulatory landscape entirely. This is not only unjust, it is short-sighted, and it will cost lives. We urge the committee to withdraw the bill in full. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa.
Kia ora. Thank you both. We have gone slightly over time, so we don't have time for questions, but appreciate your fulsome submission. We're now going to go to Hamish Jarvie, who is with the Methodist Alliance. He's online.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. We have you for 10 minutes, but of course you can leave time for questions if you can finish around 7 minutes or so.
Ngā mihi. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Hamish Jarvie tōku ingoa. I'm the Kairuruku, the National Coordinator of the Methodist Alliance. So the Methodist Alliance is a formal alliance of Methodist missions, parishes, and community-based social services and trusts, including cooperating ventures. The Methodist Alliance brings together a number of large and medium social service providers, including Methodist missions, Methodist social service providers across the motu, as well as Siaola Vaiwhanua Tongan Methodist Mission in Punaoa, Sinoti Samoa, as well as Te Taha Māori. So firstly, thank you for having me and for allowing us to have a voice in this space. Obviously, we've written a written submission as well. And so we're just going to briefly touch on a couple of sort of major points from our submission and go over them, I guess, in potentially not as much depth. So firstly, we wanted to touch on the exclusion of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in this proposed legislation. So the Methodist Alliance understands Te Tiriti o Waitangi is the foundational document of Aotearoa New Zealand as a covenant both between Māori and the Crown, but also between Māori and Tauiwi, and is the basis of our existence as a society here today. As it touches on a pretty significant amount of governance, it would be really important for this bill to include mention of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and to include it in its principles of good legislation. And without it, it really doesn't represent Aotearoa and the values that we hold to be true and to be inherent in our society. So next up is public opinion. So as you would have seen, obviously, in pretty long submissions and a long set of submissions in select committee, but also in written submissions, the public is overwhelmingly opposed to this bill. And the majority of the people in organisations who have come along to submit are opposed to it for a number of different reasons. And it's quite ironic that the bill makes prominent mention of the need to consult robustly while the bill has not been consulted on robustly from our perspective, and the opinions of those who have been consulted on and the majority have not been listened to, and it's come to this point. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was the importance of the common good. So we understand good legislation as putting the well-being of both society, its people, and the environment first, as opposed to the profit and well-being of the individual. We believe that the well-being of the collective serves the well-being of the individual, and only as part of the collective can we have real well-being. And the legislation only explicitly mentions the rights of a person. Whether or not that would potentially extend to the rights of a company, it doesn't mention the well-being of the collective, our society, or the environment, which we believe is a major area that's been overlooked. Next, I wanted to talk about replication and efficiency. So the bill intends to provide a framework for assessing legislation prior to its passing, but also after its passing. But this ignores the fact that we have a robust process already in place, which could, if necessary, be reworked or be adjusted in order to get better legislation. We have a number of avenues which I won't list in their entirety, but we have the LDAC, the Legislation Design and Advisory Committee, the Regulations Review Committee, but also regulatory impact statements, of which the regulatory impact statement for this bill only had a significant number of questionable or negative things to say about the bill and whether it would achieve its aims. So the final thing that I wanted to touch on was the Regulatory Standards Board. Having this board appointed by the Minister and having the only requirement to be that they have the appropriate knowledge, skills, and experience to assist the board to perform its functions in the opinion of the Minister, leaves the board open to a significant amount of bias. If it's appointed by a singular minister, we can assume that the people that are appointed to the board will hold similar views to the minister and will generally lean things in that direction. So those are all the points that I wanted to cover today, and so I'll finish up there.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Hamish. I don't appear to see any questions from members, so we will leave it there, but thank you for your submission, both written and oral. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou.
Ngā mihi. We've got Paul Thistle from Rights Aotearoa, I believe, online.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to publicly state the pronunciation of my name is Paul Thistol, because Sean Plunkett on the platform gets it wrong all the time.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for offering me the opportunity to speak on behalf of Rights Aotearoa. I will launch straight into it. The Regulatory Standards Bill is a constitutional coup d'etat by other means. It permanently imposes a neoliberal straitjacket upon the entire machinery of government and constrains the future choices of democratically elected parliaments, while trashing our implied constitutional settings. In doing this, it actively disenfranchises voters who don't subscribe to the political ideology of neoliberalism and who don't sleep with a copy of Anarchy, State and Utopia by Robert Nozick under their pillow. The bill is fundamentally inconsistent with the entire human rights framework that has been enacted in New Zealand since Peter Fraser signed us up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And that is the topic I will explore in depth in my submission. It also completely erases and invalidates Te Tiriti o Waitangi, particularly the obligations placed on the Crown, and fundamentally destroys the enduring bicultural partnership upon which we are founded. In the short time I have, I will not explore this aspect, as there are several speakers whose expertise, mana, and energy in this area greatly eclipse mine. But I implore the committee to take note of the submissions of Ms. Waikato, Ms. Nata, Dr. Carmen Jones, and Natalie Coates. The implications of passing this bill in its current form on our human rights framework are utterly profound. Putting this bill into law would sabotage all human rights legal activity and create immense confusion, and I'm not being hyperbolic, for the next reason. And the Human Rights Commission made this point in their submission. I was very pleased that they made the same point as me. It is axiomatic that human rights are indivisible. It's a foundational point about the moral and philosophical ontology of universal human rights. They must all exist with the same importance. Now, I respectfully ask the committee members to pause for 5 seconds and just reflect on this for a second. In your mind's eye, place all the human rights like a structural arch and not as a hierarchy. It's very important. Because if one right was to become more of a right than the others, then all the others would be diminished. And inter-rights conflict comes along every day and comes along in every courthouse in New Zealand every day. And that right would gradually start to subsume all the other rights and play an outsized role. If you'll forgive me an 80s reference, like Pac-Man gobbling up the dots, the elevated right would consume progressively all the other rights, growing larger while diminishing the rest. And that is exactly what this bill does. It says that a cluster of human rights centered around individualism and property are more important than the others. Proposing this bill is an overt act of political philosophy that keeps beyond elections, keeps into the future. Now, I will be in a different select committee room on Friday arguing that another government bill also imposes a hierarchy of rights. In that case, it's putting free speech absolutism over the right to be free from hate speech. Now, proposing that there is a hierarchy of rights upsets a highly delicate balance that our law has been designed around. In particular, clauses like Section 5 of the Bill of Rights Act guide how conflicts between rights should be managed. If this bill goes ahead, then Section 5 of BORA becomes very unworkable indeed in practice. Now, a real-world concrete consequence of passing the law in its current form is that if complying with non-discrimination provisions of the Human Rights Act had a tangible cost and impact on private enterprise, it could be challenged. This would be intolerable, as anti-discrimination measures must not be at the whim of billionaires and the capitalist class. Now, let's do a little hypothetical. Just suppose we trash our constitutional settings with this wrecking ball of a bill, rip up our founding treaty, and say it's okay to discriminate against people just to appease the capital classes and Elon Musk. Would this bill improve the economy? Now, Mr. Chair, I actually support the Deputy Prime Minister's goal about making a more productive economy, definitely. So, as well as being a human rights professional, I have a master's degree in business from one of the world's finest institutions, London Business School. And I say this not to brag, but because I want what I'm about to say not to be dismissed as the rantings of a deranged woke lefty Marxist who lives in Tamitha Paul's electorate. And I'd like to say I'm only 4 of those things. And there's definitely no communist students club at London Business School, although there is a Swiss luxury watch club. It is my considered professional assessment that this bill would have an overall negative net impact on the economy. It will make our current situation where butter is $18 in an Auckland supermarket worse. Why? Because it will make regulatory capture much, much, much worse. Entrenched interests will game the system, and monopolistic behavior will be enabled and actively encouraged. This bill will make butter more expensive at a time when the citizenry is ready to riot over the cost of living. When Fonterra argues that competition compliance costs are unreasonable, they'll have this bill in their back pocket as a weapon. The same goes for supermarket duopolies resisting fair trading measures. Now, at business school, it was axiomatic that if you can, you should always try to engage in regulatory capture because it gives you a strategic competitive advantage. or in regulatory arbitrage like Uber. Now, a couple of days ago, I was wondering how to prove this point to you, and the perfect evidence fell in my lap. Last week, the media reported that the security services said in their assessment that the Regulatory Standards Bill could be subject to interference from nefarious foreign actors. Well, if that is the case, then it is logically implied that it can also be subject to nefarious corporate actors, and it will be. And Andrew Hampton, the head of the GCSB, is not known for his alarmist assessments, and if he is a woke lefty Marxist, I would hope that his employer knows. In summary, Mr. Chair, I implore you to recommend the wholesale rejection of this bill. It's unfixable. There's no possible world in which it works in its current form. Lastly, the greatest political project that any political party could embark upon would be to deal with regulatory capture whilst upholding our human rights commitments and honouring futurity. But unfortunately, that would require dealing with the thorny, intractable problem of political campaign finance reform. And no party wants to touch that. So lastly, should this bill pass in its current form, then on the day it comes into force, I personally, in my personal capacity, will file for declaration of inconsistency with the Bill of Rights Act, because that is the only remedy that is really available to us that is non-violent if this bill passes in its current form. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul, for that. There doesn't appear to be any questions, and we're nearly at time. So thank you for that. It was very comprehensive.
Thank you. And I'd also like to say I've had very good dealings with both Mr. Stevenson and Ms. Russell on this committee, even though Mr. Stevenson and I disagree on a few things. He's a fine parliamentarian.
Some academic jousting.
Yes, he's very good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Pleasure. See you. Okay, in select committee room, we have Jalessa Peniro on behalf of Wairera Runanga Incorporated Society. So we'll welcome you up to the table. Sorry, my screen's being a bit frozen, but hope you can hear all right. Welcome. Of course, we've got you for 10 minutes, so feel free to finish early if you'd like some questions or engagement with the committee.
Kia ora. Well, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Jalessa Peniro tōku ingoa. Joining me today is Dr. Alvina Edwards, a Wairera Executive Member, Head of Sport. Ko te timana hau o Wairera Runanga. I am the chairperson of Wairera Runanga, one of 18 papatapu runanga that make up Ngāi Tahu, based on the Banks Peninsula of Te Waiponamu. I stand here today not just as a representative for my hapu, Ngā Tere Kehu, but as a 32-year-old mother to an 8-month-old baby, someone who feels the full weight of the responsibility to speak for our tamariki, our whenua, and our future. Like the tens of thousands of others, we oppose this bill. You've heard the arguments. They've been made well, and they've been made clearly. They've been made from a range of different rōpū, unions, iwi, academics, environmentalists, legal experts, business owners, and everyday citizens. You've also received a written submission from Wairera Runanga, which I'll take as read. So today I won't repeat every point. Instead, I want to speak to something a little more deeper. Something both personal and collective. Something that's been increasingly difficult to hold on to in the face of this coalition government's actions. And that is hope. Because if I'm honest, everything about how this bill has been handled, from rushed consultation to ignoring expert advice, tells me, well, I shouldn't have hope. When I took the time to read the documentation behind this bill, not just the bill itself, but the cabinet paper and all its annexes, I was struck not just by the content, but by the tone. It was dismissive, predetermined, and hollow in its engagement with public feedback. The cabinet paper acknowledges over 23,000 people made submissions during the initial consultation, and that almost 90% opposed the bill. And yet, the minister states plainly he intends to proceed with substantially similar approach to the one he first proposed. There's no sign that any of those voices, Māori, union, academics, environmental activists, everyday citizens, really changed the substance of the bill. It reads as if consultation was merely a tick box exercise, not a conversation to be had. Annex 2, the regulatory impact statement, is meant to be the analytical backbone to any good legislation. And even there, the authors raise red flags. They say, the bill is unlikely to be the most efficient way to achieve its goals and may actually increase costs, while having uncertain impact on regulatory quality. So, I mean, even their own government's own officials are questioning whether this bill will do as it claims. Annex 1, the summary of public submission during initial consultation, lays out clearly why people oppose this bill. Because it elevates property rights above collective wellbeing, because it excludes Te Tiriti o Waitangi, because it opens the door to corporate interference and undermines future legislation aimed at equity and environmental protection. None of that has been substantively addressed. Then I read Annex 3, which attempts to explain the treaty implications. It simply states that the impact on Māori will depend on implementation. But that's not treaty analysis, that's abdication. As disheartening as that is, what strikes even more deeply is this: the complete absence of genuine partnership with Māori. Now, let me be clear. Partnership isn't one party setting the rules while the other is expected to comply. True partnership means shared decision-making, mutual respect, inclusion that is deep and meaningful, not decorative. Māori are not passive recipients of regulation. We are kaitiaki, treaty partners, and rightful decision makers. As we know, Aotearoa is home to many cultures, but it is Māori who formed the foundation. There is great beauty in our diversity, but yet, too often, we are unsettled by what makes us unique. So, how can anyone genuinely claim to represent all New Zealanders if this bill marginalises and sidelines tangata whenua as treaty partners? How can it be called fair or a true reflection of treaty partnership if it strips Māori of the protections guaranteed under Te Tiriti o Waitangi? The bill reflects that discomfort. It attempts to flatten us into a single uniform model of law, one that ignores the layered living whakapapa of this whenua. Annex 5 includes feedback from key departments, Te Puni Kōkiri, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of the Environment, the Public Service Commission. They all raise serious concerns about cost, workability, democratic accountability, and the complete absence of Te Tiriti in the bill's principles. Yet, those warnings, like the public submissions, were ignored. It's unsettling and perhaps deliberately so. I read all of this as a citizen of Aotearoa, as a mum, as someone trying to participate in a democratic process. And it's hard, you know, not to feel disillusioned, to feel like this whole thing is, well, theatre. that the decisions were made before we were ever asked. Because I asked, what actually changed after all that feedback? Nothing. And yet, here I am. I keep showing up, and here's why. Because I believe that democracy isn't just something that we do every 3 years. Because I want my tamariki to grow up knowing that their voices count. Because silence has never served our people. I show up because I've seen what is possible when our voices are heard. When legislation reflects the diversity, the dignity, and the whakapapa of this whenua. Hope isn't naive. It is a form of resistance. And I hope that you carry that with you when you decide whether this bill reflects who we are or who we should never become. And so I leave this with you. Choose wisely. We're watching. We're still here, and we'll never stop showing up. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora. Thank you for that. Looks like we've got a question from Rawiri Waititi.
No question, just ngā mihi niu kia koutou mo tērā mo wera kōrero. Kia ora tātou.
Oh, it was just a peace wave.
Kia ora.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, our next submitters are in the house behind you. Nai Taikura, Taio or Tūwharetoa. We've got Nā Taikura. No, sorry. We've got Jalissa Paniro presenting, I believe.
Tēnā koutou e te komiti, ko tāna kupa tōku ingoa, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Tūwharetoa, no ngā awa, ngā roto, te moana, me ngā maunga e te aki tonu nei ia mātou. We take our written submission as read and intend to use this oral submission to further elaborate on key matters of fact, particularly those relating to the practical and cultural impacts this bill would have on us as tangata whenua and kaitiaki of these lands and waters. Today I speak on behalf of Ngā Taikura Taiao o Tūwharetoa, a collective of rangatahi grounded in our whakapapa, tikanga, and the sacred responsibility of kaitiakitanga. We are not here simply to speak. We are here to protect what we have inherited and what we are determined to pass on. We are here to protect our whakapapa. We stand in strong and clear opposition to the Regulatory Standards Bill because this bill is not just out of touch, it is dangerous. It is disconnected from our values, it is disconnected from the current state of our environment, and most of all, it is disconnected from our future. As rangatahi Māori, our relationship with Te Taiao is not theatrical. It is not something we've learned at school or read in a report. It is inherited, embodied, and alive. Our ngāhere is not just a resource, it is a tūpuna. Our awa is not just water, it is a bloodline. The whenua is not just dirt and pasture, it is identity, memory, and obligation. We do not use the environment, we descend from it, walk with it, and belong with it, to it. But neoliberal frameworks treat Te Taiao as an asset, something to be managed and exploited. This bill reinforces that mindset. It prioritizes short-term growth and market convenience over long-term guardianship. It places economic metrics above Māori. It sees Te Taiao not as a living system to be restored, but as a ledger item to be regulated. It privileges economic growth over environmental integrity. It promotes efficiency at the expense of long-term well-being. When the law fails to recognize the sacredness of Te Taiao, it fails us. When legislation threatens the Māori of ecosystems, it rejects our whakapapa and the laws of this land. Our environment is already in crisis. not a future crisis, but a present one. We've watched our lakes rise in temperature. We've seen our rivers choke with sediment and toxins. We've seen the ngahere grow quiet. The manu are gone, the rākau are stressed, the puna run dry. These aren't abstract statistics, they are tohu taiao. They are signs from our tūpuna, clear and deliberate warnings that the balance of the natural world is breaking. But instead of responding with compassion, this bill responds with deregulation. It makes it easier for developers to break ground. It makes it harder for communities to protect what they love. It's like watching the whare burn and arguing over the price of water. Rangatahi Māori are raised to think not in quarters or political cycles, but in generations. Every action we take is guided by how it will impact our mokupuna. We are nurtured in whanaungatanga, we uphold manaakitanga, and we practice kaitiakitanga. These are not values we simply refer to, they are values that we live and practice every day. This bill does not reflect those principles. It was not written with mokupuna in mind. It was designed for today's market, prioritizing economic convenience over environmental responsibility. This is not only a failure of environmental logic, it is a failure of leadership. It dismisses the knowledge of those who have protected these lands across generations, and it underestimates the capability and commitment of those now stepping forward to uphold that responsibility.
Tēnā anō tātou, ko wahine tapu murcha hau, huri hoki no ngā tutu wharetoa. I'm here today not to add another voice, but to remind this committee that we are not a future problem, we're the present reality. This bill undermines the role of mātauranga Māori in environmental governance. Mātauranga Māori is not a relic of the past. It is a living, evolving system of knowledge that guides how we understand and protect te taiao. It includes centuries of observation, adaptation, and physical relationship with the whenua, the wai, our ngahere, and the changing seasons. It is science, but it is also philosophy, spirituality, and lived practice that connects people, place, and purpose. In many places, mātauranga Māori is the only consistent, localized environmental intelligence that exists, especially where Western science is yet to catch up or where community-specific solutions are needed. Yet the Regulatory Standards Bill fails entirely to acknowledge this. Instead, the bill embeds a framework that centers Western economics and narrow legal interpretations as the dominant authority. And the problem with that is that under the system, what counts as evidence or logic is filtered through a worldview that sees the taiao as a resource, not as a relative. We're constantly told that we're the leaders of tomorrow. But how can we lead when the system shuts us out? How can we lead if we're not even in the room? This bill consolidates power in political and legal institutions, the very institutions that already struggle to include us. That is completely wrong, and we are not okay with that. Our voices are not decorative, they are decisive. We bring inherited wisdom and fierce urgency. We call it the fire in our puku, given to us by our mothers while fighting the exact same battles. We know what's at stake because we are the ones who live with the consequences. This bill freezes the system when we need transformation. Climate change is not theoretical, we're already seeing it. Flooding where there never was, drought where there never used to be, invasive species, including humanity, helping the collapse of ecosystems and stressed whenua. And yet this bill promotes regulatory stability as if that's still what matters, as if this is the time to slow things down. But this is not the time for business as usual. This is the time for bold, adaptive decisions that move at the speed of crisis. This is the time to lead with courage, not constraint. This bill sends a painful message to us. It tells us that our identity doesn't matter, that our knowledge isn't valid, that our future is optional, and yet we're the ones showing up. We are the ones chanting karakia over the awa as more wastewater flows. We are the ones protecting our wāhi tapu when the excavator hits the ground. We are the ones reviving food sovereignty, restoring balance and walking backwards into the future. We don't do this because it's easy. We do it because it's our lifetime obligation. We were the watching mokopuna, and now we need the lawmakers to fall back and let us shape our world. Because when a bill tells us you don't belong here, we hear it and we feel it and we act on it. Let me be clear, we will never stop acting on it. In closing, this bill doesn't reflect us, it doesn't serve us, and it does not protect the whenua, the wai, or the whakapapa we are here to uphold. We ask this committee, please reject this bill. Senta te taiao as taonga, not transaction. Recognise and protect mātauranga Māori as a source of real authority. Embed rangatahi Māori in decision-making, not as a gesture, but as partners. Because we're not waiting to be invited, we're already living the change. If you love where you live, reject the bill in its entirety and let the revolution happen. Tēnā koutou.
Kia ora, thank you. We have met full time, but thank you both for your strong submissions. Wahine and Taina, appreciate you coming in to the House today. We now got a second to last submission for the day from the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers of Aotearoa, New Zealand. We welcome Marilyn, Marion, and Quinton to the table.
Oh, tēnā koutou, ko Marilyn Hedaho. I'm here with my fellow friends, Marion Leighton and Quentin Abraham, representing Quakers New Zealand, Te Hāhi Tūhohiri. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to our written submission, which will take as read. The Religious Society of Friends, to give us our official name, was founded in 1652, and although relatively small in number, our influence with the abolition of slavery, penal reform, and advocacy for peace, equal rights, and social justice is widely recognised and continues to this day. Quakers have no creed, but uphold the testimonies of truth, peace, integrity, simplicity, community, and equality. Our conviction of the inherent dignity and worth of all people has focused our attention on the disadvantaged and marginalised, recognising the innate inequality of many areas of society. Quakers New Zealand strongly opposes the Regulatory Standards Bill because we are convinced that it will exacerbate many of these inequalities, undermining the ability of government to act for the common good, to listen to the people, and to protect the vulnerable.
Tēnā rā koutou, Finance and Expenditure Committee. Thank you for your time today. For Marion Leighton Aho, I'm a specialist physician and a Quaker. On democratic process, Quakerism, the Religious Society of Friends, was born of democracy, of the equality of all people and in the bonds of friendship. Society functions because of how we know each other, our familial bonds and deep friendships that New Zealanders value, including our relationship with our diverse whenua and unique species. Quakers oppose the Regulatory Standards Bill because it works to undermine the key concepts that New Zealanders hold at the core of their being about fairness and equity. The principles of the bill speak to property rights, but do not mention other human rights, children's rights, the right to safety, to improve our health, the protection of our precious environment. These rights have their own regulatory framework, and this bill seeks to destabilise our legislation in pursuit of property or monetary gain. On the principle of collective versus individual rights, Quakers have a very personal view of religious faith, but we apply this faith to a holistic view of society, believing that all individuals possess inherent dignity and worth. Our conviction that there is that of God in everyone has driven centuries of pacifism, equal rights, prison reform, the abolition of slavery, and fair business practices. This belief has led us to pay great attention to the disadvantaged and marginalised, recognising the inequality inherent in diverse societies. Wealth, health, ability, whānau, community, location, opportunities, luck are all factors over which individuals have no control, but which governments can significantly influence through the regulation of standards that support good outcomes. A thriving, productive society of well-educated, healthy people is dependent on universal systems that support us all to realise our potential. On the principle of equality, Quakers have a testimony to equality and have lived this experience for almost 400 years. Quakers know that societal equality is gained through equity, not offering everyone the same, but ensuring everyone has what they need. Some people need different or targeted services, and those who have been systematically disenfranchised over generations need redress. Those who live rurally need specific health services and transport options that city dwellers don't. Those who are older need their pensions and community support. This bill favours sameness and not equity. Furthermore, the criteria for success is limited to cost efficiency alone. As Quakers, we believe our common humanity transcends our differences. True equality lays a foundation for community and friendship. It builds trust, it's essential to society, and this bill limits equality to each individual or individual entity as an island entitled to an equal proportion of community asset. By prioritising property rights, it elevates those who currently have more wealth and land to give them additional rights over other New Zealanders. We need regulation that focuses on our needs, not on the wants of the privileged. On simplicity, ethics, and coherence, Quakers have a testimony to simplicity. This bill will be expensive, increase bureaucracy, and it does not demonstrate meaningful improvement on existing regulation. The bill does not meet its own regulatory standards to consult and listen to people. Moreover, the bill misses the opportunity to expressly exclude behaviour that is contrary to acting fairly or is against the public interest. Quakers are and have been successful business people. They established well-known chocolate companies such as Cadbury's and Rowntree's. These companies thrive because they had regulation that ethically underpinned their business. Workers had a safe working environment, they were paid a wage that enhanced their well-being, and that quality of the product was more important than pure pursuit of profit. Quaker businesses today subscribe to these principles. They know that regulation based on an ethical framework is not only morally sound, but good for long-term business success. The Regulatory Standards Bill lacks an ethical core, which is not good for business in Aotearoa.
Tēnā rā koutou, the Finance and Expenditure Committee. Ko Quentin Abraham tōku ingoa. I'm a Quaker, a psychologist and a business owner, and I will speak to Te Tiriti protocols, tikanga, and moral principles. On Te Tiriti, Quakers, the Religious Society of Friends, considered Te Tiriti to be a sacred covenant. Our word is our bond. We've made a promise, a commitment to acknowledge the rights and tino rangatiratanga of tangata whenua. There are no references in the bill to Te Tiriti and only 7 references to the treaty in the introduction and interpretation sections referring to the Treaty Settlement Act and what it means. The bill proposes that the current and future legislation must comply with these priorities. These priorities do not mention Te Tiriti, which could effectively remove the treaty principles from the lawmaking process, which is a violation of Te Tiriti. The bill does not reference Te Tiriti and the collective Māori rights to land, water and resources. It prioritises private property rights and as a result undermines kaitiakitanga and tino rangatiratanga. It is not clear how the regulatory principles laid out in the bill will be reconciled with Te Tiriti. The bill's definitions reduce those considered substantially affected by the legislation to those who are directly and materially affected. This limits the ability of iwi and hapu to participate in a lawmaking process. The Religious Society of Friends upholds peaceful ways to manage conflict. By limiting consultation and by ignoring Te Tiriti, the bill will create increased unrest, confusion and division between tangata whenua and tangata tiriti. It will not achieve greater clarity as intended in lawmaking. This bill has a potential to steer our country towards unhelpful conflict, undoing years of redress and apologies made in treaty settlements. On protocols and tikanga, the Society of Friends has endured and prospered since the 1600s due to the collective discipline and protocols that are upheld by everyone. We need effective regulation, and there are already good processes in place without this bill. The bill has a narrow focus on individual rights, property and finance, This leaves the most vulnerable in our communities targeted for profit, even if it undermines well-being. For example, the harm from alcohol, gambling, tobacco, and pharmaceutical companies is currently regulated by governments to reduce the harm to our citizens. This bill could allow those companies to challenge this regulation and pass on the cost for compensation to the taxpayer. The regulations required in this bill will not benefit all peoples in Aotearoa. On moral principles, the Bill Part 2 20A states its purpose as to assist in the orderly development of industry and commerce and to promote its efficiency and the welfare of consumers through the regulation where desirable in the public interest of trade practices. This bill favours economic cost savings rather than doing what is right to uphold the well-being of our communities, to maintain dignity, autonomy and inclusion of everyone. Sometimes we need to pay more because it's the right thing to do, such as paying for higher quality food in our children's school meals. In conclusion, as Friends, we believe good quality and enduring decisions take time. This bill has not been introduced in the spirit of democracy and good governance. We note the limited time for consultation, the introduction of the bill under urgency, the denigration of those who offer an opposing view. There is no convincing evidence that this would improve our existing regulatory framework to justify the annual $20 million cost. We hope our politicians will respond to the overwhelming number of submissions that reject this bill. As a Society of Friends, we oppose the Regulatory Standards Bill.
Thank you, Quintin, Marion and Marilyn. We are at full time, but appreciate you making the effort despite it being a bit quiet in there.
Thank you.
Best wishes. We're now going to go back online. We've got Waikato River Authority joining us for our final submission this evening. We've got Antoine Coffin, welcome. And I believe you're going to be joined up. Here we are, Stuart Kneebone. Welcome to you both. You've got 10 minutes, but of course you can finish early and we welcome a few questions as well. In your hands.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chair, and tēnā koutou, good afternoon. E mihi kawana kia koutou ngā rangatira. Ko tai mai nei ki te whakaronga ki ngā kōrero e pāna ki tēnei o tātou kaupapa. Ora kanui ngā mihi. Hey, thank you for the opportunity. My name's Antoine Coffin and beside me is Stu Kneebone, one of our co-chairs for the Waikato River Authority. I'm the Chief Executive for the Waikato River Authority. Our purpose and our function is to set the primary direction through the vision and strategy to Ture Whaimana to achieve the restoration, protection and health and well-being of our Waikato and Waipa rivers. We promote an integrated, holistic and coordinated approach to both the implementation of the Ture Whaimana and the management of our awa. We also fund each year rehabilitation initiatives for the Waikato River. Our organisation is the result of a treaty settlement by Waikato iwi and a number of other iwi on the Waikato and Waipa to restore the river to its pristine state. And so we have an intergenerational challenge in front of us. We oppose the bill and we recommend that it does not proceed. Our understanding of the bill is that it's intended to set a benchmark for good legislation by establishing a set of principles of responsible regulation and processes to be followed. The bill is far-reaching. The powers to be exercised, in our view, are broad and profound. Lawmakers have been given the task, in result of this bill, to review new and existing legislation against the principles set out in the bill to ensure consistency and, to our understanding, with some exclusions around the treaty settlements and operation of the New Zealand Armed Forces. From our submission, we really want to reinforce three key points. The first is the reasons why we believe the bill should not proceed. First, it's unnecessary. New Zealand's current regulatory equality and the checks and balances and lawmaking processes already exist in New Zealand. Two, in its current form, it does not recognise or uphold the treaty settlement arrangements. And further to that, the River Authority has a particular interest in this because we are the co-governance organisation with equal Crown and River iwi representatives, and we are charged with upholding Te Ture Whaimana, the vision and strategy for the Waikato and Waipa rivers. And thirdly is related to the changes that were required for the bill if the Select Committee recommends it proceeds. And I should say with some emphasis that we do not believe that the bill should proceed, but if the Select Committee was of a mind to recommend that it does proceed, we have recommended a number of changes that should be made to the bill. Even then, we don't think that those fixes would be sufficient to meet our deep concerns. In terms of summary of our submission, the processes the bill sets up are, in our view, unnecessary due to New Zealand's current regulatory quality and checks and balances, as I mentioned. But just to name a few of these checks and balances, we have the Legislation Design and Advisory Committee, we have the Legislation Guidelines 2021, and we have other overarching legislation that guides New Zealand, such as the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990, the Legislation Act 2019, and the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi determined in the courts. The River Authority opposes the bill on the grounds that the bill and its principles do not currently respect the diverse range of perspectives and values New Zealanders have, including the perspectives and values of iwi, hapu and Māori. And it's been interesting just to tune in today and listen to some of the other representatives who have reinforced this for the committee's benefit. It's particularly concerning that the bill does not have a general Treaty of Waitangi clause. The River Authority notes that the existing guidance on good lawmaking, specifically in the legislation guidelines, contains an entire chapter dedicated to lawmaking consistent with Te Tiriti. Treaty settlement acts and bills are excluded from views under the bill. This is an essential safeguard necessary to protect the integrity of treaty settlements. However, the bill has the potential to still undermine the treaty settlement arrangements for the Waikato and Waipa rivers and their catchments when agencies seek to undertake reviews of other acts. If passed in its current form, the bill would not recognise or uphold those treaty settlement arrangements included in non-treaty settlement acts, such as Te Ture Whaimana and the RMA. The River Authority is also concerned about the requirement for compensation when legislation authorises the taking or impairment of property. In this case, this could involve reducing property rights for landowners where it harms the health of the river. Again, very specific, Clause 8, C, subsection Roman numeral 3, states that the compensation will be provided by people that receive the benefit. This is particularly concerning for the River Authority, where we might have an example where landowners are required to use more of their land for riparian planting, effectively setting it aside, or even when excluding stock from the river by fencing to mitigate against contaminants entering a river. And this could require, as a result of the bill, that our council, the government, or even ourselves, the River Authority, is expected to provide compensation for that potential loss. We think that would be an obscene outcome as a result of the bill's principles in regards to property. The River Authority considers it untenable and may restrict councils, governments from putting in place regulations that benefit the health of water bodies. The bill also requires that the River Authority require us under Clause 43.2a Roman numeral 4 to provide any information that is necessary or desirable to enable the Regulatory Standards Ministry to review in whole or in part any regulatory system to which any legislation relates. These are extraordinary powers to have. We think the very broad information requirements could be challenging to meet, of course, and if they were not complied with, the Chief Executive has powers, this is the Chief Executive of the Ministry of Regulation, can apply to the High Court for an order to require that information be shared. We think that's, in a democracy, that's an obscene amount of power. Finally, the River Authority raised a concern about the Regulatory Standards Board and the broad power it has. Firstly, the board can inquire into existing legislation to assess whether it's consistent with the principles that it sets out. And the River Authority considers this as too broad and too subjective. The River Authority also considers that it's inappropriate that a minister chooses the members of the board. There are no requirements in the bill for the type of skill set the members should have, apart from what the minister considers appropriate. So effectively, it's been given these broad extraordinary powers, and they can go off and choose who they like to be on there without any particular guidelines, and that is of deep concern to us. The River Authority has suggested a number of changes in its submission to the bill, and where the Select Committee may recommend that this be proceeded. And these include such things as a Te Tiriti o Waitangi clause, the inclusion of principles that recognise the natural environment, ecosystems, and the relationship people have with the environment, a rethink of how systemic inequalities are addressed, inclusion of principles that respect and give meaning to the diversity of values, perspectives, and rights of New Zealand citizens, including hapu, iwi, and Māori, specific recognition of treaty settlements and arrangements and other pieces of legislation, changes to the selection process for a regulatory standards board, and greater clarity and certainty relating to property rights, and changes to clauses 42 and 43 that clarify what information may be required and clear processes for disclosures. That said, and this is the but, our overall view is that even with our suggested changes, these would be inadequate to fix the inherent deficiencies and broad powers that are infused into the bill. We again reiterate that it is an unnecessary and a frustrating proposal. That's our submission.
Thank you. We've got time for a quick question from Huhana Linden.
Tēnā koutou. It's not a question, Mr. Chair, it's a mihi, because you've raised so many elements that have captured both the concerns of Regional Council and also through the settlement that you've clearly articulated. So it's just a big mihi, really, because you've really introduced the issues that are at the crux of many of us in iwi Māori, but also local government have brought forward. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Okay, well, thank you both for your submission. Appreciate the effort. Tēnā korua, ka kite anō.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ka nui ngā mihi.
Ngā mihi. Members, that brings us to the end of our day. I just want to acknowledge staff before we go. Thank you for lining up submissions flawlessly. Just want to acknowledge the work that you've done behind the scenes as well. Thank you, members, for a great kōrero and good discussion. And for those that are blessed with a full day tomorrow, wish you all the best.
Thank you, Chair, for all the sharing.
Pleasure. Thank you. Ngā mihi.
Ngā mihi.
Thank you, team.